Good morning, everybody. I'd like to welcome you all to Derrynane on behalf of National Historic Properties and the Office of Public Works. It's great to see some element of normality return and be able to host these types of events. It's one of the events at Derrynane that helps mark the passing of the annual calendar, so we kind of missed it last year. We all forgot our Christmas shopping, so we're delighted to be able to host it again here. And I suppose we're all acutely aware of the importance of parks and gardens and horticulture and the contribution that they've had over the last couple of years. So I'm delighted that James O'Shea, Chris Maguire on the OPW team are able to talk about the gardens. But just a few housekeeping rules. If everyone can have your phones on silent, please. And at lunch and tea break, our stewards will guide you. So if you can follow their lead, we've put in place various safety measures. So if you could follow those, please, and please keep your face coverings on while you're inside. And for the question and answer, that's a bit different this year. There'll be a microphone at the rear of each aisle in each of the three rooms. If anyone has a question, if you can please go to the aisle rather than passing microphones around the room. So no, thank you all for coming. I'm delighted that you could all make it and hope that you have an enjoyable day. And I'll pass you over to Murish now.
Thanks, Chris. I'll try and resist not talking for too long. But I just want to welcome you all here this morning. Just 2 points I want to make. Every year we have some kind of challenge. This year we have 2. The first is trying to survive without Mary O'Connor. Because Mary O'Connor, as you know, is our chairperson. She's the person who organises everything and makes everything tick. And fortunately, maybe for her, certainly unfortunately for us, she's a family wedding today, so there's nothing mysterious about her absence, so we hope she'll enjoy herself and have a well-earned glass of sparkling water or whatever it is her poison. So anyway, we would not like to not mention Mary's role just because she's not here. The second challenge is that when we were putting the programme together, we allocated a 2-hour time slot between the end of the pre-lunch session and the Daniel O'Connell lecture. And that is because one of the aspects of the school by which we set great store, which has been very difficult really to organise this year, is the sociability side. We couldn't do it in Carsavine yesterday, but we thought in an airy place like this, that 2 hours would give people a chance not just to have lunch, but to exchange pleasantries and to renew friendships and all that sort of thing. But given the day that's in it, and given the weather, we normally meet, as you know, in the middle of the summer. I think this is would be a challenge, even as interesting as we think we are. I don't know if we could put up with one another for 2 hours. So what we've decided to do is to move forward the time of the Daniel O'Connell lecture, which is scheduled in the brochure, I think for 2. Is it 3 for 3? To move it back to 1:30. So that gives us approximately an hour over lunch, which I think is enough. So that is the second challenge, which I'm sure we'll overcome. It just remains for me to say to enjoy the day. I mean, it's always a great pleasure to be here in Derrynane. Lecturers are always interesting, and always interesting to have them here. So with that, I'll pass over to Mary Lyon, who'll moderate the first session. Thank you very much.
Bhawallam fáilte a chur roimh gach duine atá an seo in jobh I teacht Derrynane. Our first speaker today is Professor Elva Johnson, who is Assistant Professor of History at UCD. She is a historian of the late antique and early medieval period. Her work, Literacy and Identity in Early Medieval Ireland, was awarded the prestigious Irish Historical Research Prize in 2015. She has published numerous articles on history and medieval and Celtic studies. Her topic today will look at the impact of saints such as Crohan and Finian on the religious and cultural memory of South Kerry. So we're in for a very interesting talk. I'm sure you're welcome, Elva.
Before I start, I would just like to thank everybody, particularly Morris, for inviting me to come here. I mean, it's an absolutely amazing and beautiful location, and it's really exciting for me to be actually talking about a topic in the landscape which has effectively produced it. I'd also like to thank Mary, who's not here, for dealing with my increasingly panicked emails over the last week when I suddenly realised I had to be here and I had to give a talk and so on. So, as I said, it's just a great honour to be here, and it's brilliant to be in this setting. So what I'm going to do today is talk to you a bit about the cults of the saints in this part of Kerry. And on the opening slide, you can see the name. If you just look up on the left-hand margin, you can see the name of Fianán Caum, and he's one of the most important saints in the region. And this is from a manuscript which is in UCD. It's part of the old Franciscan collection, and it's one of the manuscripts and also the texts that come out of it that I'll be discussing a bit. But what I'm also expecting is that people here will know probably a lot more about the landscape and maybe the interconnections of these cults over time. So I'll be really interested in hearing that. What I'd like to start with, though, is to give you just a little bit of broad context. I mean, I was looking at the programme, and it's like a brilliant programme, and I said, but you know what, I'm way earlier than everybody else, and I didn't want to assume that every one of you is obsessed with early Irish history as I am. So I said I'll start off with a bit of context anyway. So the starting point, I suppose, is the kingdoms of Kerry. And it's to give you an idea of how the different cults of the saints develop and evolve over time. So a lot of this will be familiar to you because a lot of elements of this survive into the place names of the current day. So you can see there up in Dingle, you've got the kingdom of Kirkagwina. Obviously that place name survives as Kirkagwina today. But during the period I'm looking at, that group of people, the Kirkagwina, are actually sort of growing in power, and they're extending their influence south into Ivra. So that's quite an important context for the cult of Fianán in particular. Then in the area around Listowel, you've the kingdom of Cúriga Luachra, which survives in the modern name of Kerry, obviously from Cúriga. And that's a little bit different in terms of its politics and the direction it's looking. It's looking more towards, across into Clare and then in towards Limerick. And then if you were going to say there was a kingdom of Kerry, it's the one which is based around Killarney. And this is the kingdom of the Owenach. They're a sort of a group of related dynasties who claimed the kingship of Munster. And these are the Owenach of Loch Lane. So basically right in the middle of the Killarney region. And during the period we're looking at, they're the main sort of political power, but they're in a sort of a rivalry with Kirkagwina further to the north. So those interconnections are quite important in terms of how the stories of the saints come to be told over time, because the saints aren't, they're not just individuals in their own right, they're also representatives of their communities, their aspirations, their identities. Now, why would I be talking about saints, apart from me being interested in saints, which for me might be reason enough, but obviously wouldn't be reason enough to be given a talk to you today. It's really relating back to that point I made, that saints in the early Middle Ages, so I'll be looking really, if I was to put a date on it, I'll be really looking at around the 8th century, looking back a little bit earlier, and maybe forward from that. So during this period, saints are really important to their local communities. They're a way they express their identity. They have local connections. They're connected, with families, but also with the landscape. And many of the aspirations that people have during this era are reflected in the cult of the saints. So a saint's cult isn't something which is static. So, it'll be created maybe by the veneration of a local holy person, but that veneration will change, it'll grow, sometimes it'll contract over time. And when we look at the different case studies I have for you today, we'll sort of see examples of that and how that works out in practice. So I wanted to be honest with you about the sources that I have. So I have 3 major sources that I'm going to touch on with you today. So there's the sort of, I suppose, the obvious one, which is the lives of the saints. So these are biographies that are written about saints, often by local churches. Sometimes they can vary quite a lot. So some saints' lives will be really about, say, maybe power and politics, but other saints' lives will be a lot more about the community and how the saint has an impact upon them. And the saint, one of the saints I'll be looking at today, Finan, or Finian, the number of Finians can become extremely confusing. His saint's life is one of those where it's actually really about the local communities and their connection with him, rather than about power politics. Another source I'm using are, I know this is not going to sound the most exciting thing in the morning, are texts that are known as martyrologies. And what they are is they're basically connected with the liturgy in church. So they're lists of saints' names on the day of the year that they're commemorated. So it'll be the name of the saint, maybe a bit about their family, maybe where they're located. And I think martyrologies are one of the most important sources that we have, and they're a lot more important than just lists of names. The work that I'm doing on the saints at the moment has actually come out of mainly working on these texts, and I have a database now of over 2,000 individual saints' names and over 1,500 place names. Not all of them, I'm afraid, have I been able to identify. So it's an amazing resource for us. And finally, place names, really important, because place names will sometimes commemorate individuals or peoples who don't survive in the textual record. And I mean, one thing I'd really like to emphasize is the extent to which a textual record can be very misleading when it's from this far back in time. So the sources that survive, it's sometimes accidental, or they survive because they're important to particular people, but they're not giving us the whole picture. And, you know, when we look at the landscape or when we look at place names, we can begin to fill that out a good bit more, which in a way is why sort of, you know, local memories in local communities are just so important in reconstructing this period of history. It's not all about the text. It took me a long time to come to this realization, which is a bit scary, but it did. Now, I was trying to decide how I would, you know, approach talking to you about the saints' cults today. So I'm going to combine a little bit of a sort of a chronology and also then a bit about the types of sources that I'm using. So I'm going to start off with the coming of Christianity, okay? So this is an area which has been much debated by scholars in my own field. Obviously, it becomes associated with St. Patrick, who's the best known figure from that period. You know, he's a genuine historical individual who lived in the 5th century and who left us his own writings. And, you know, you cannot emphasize enough how important those texts are. However, when we delve into the sources, it's clear that Christianity had multiple sources and there were multiple traditions, and it was only over time that the story of Patrick as a national apostle emerged. And we see this in Kerry as well. And a really interesting example of this, I sort of became obsessed with it as I was working through the material, is the cult of Derrynane in Valentia Island. So first of all, there's her feast day is on March the 22nd. She's remembered as a sister of St. Patrick, and those who are associated with the cult of Patrick, their feast days are often clustered around March the 17th. So if you look at, say, Patrick's successor, you know, supposed members of his family, they sort of cluster around that March the 17th date. Now, in Patrick's own writings, he mentions the name of his father and his grandfather. He doesn't even name his mother, though she's obviously there, or he wouldn't be there. He doesn't mention the names of any siblings. He could be an only child. We simply don't know. Now, Irish writers, when they look back on Patrick, they found this to be a huge lack. And so they named his mother. They gave her a name, Concessa, said she was that Martin of Tours, a really famous saint, was her uncle. And they gave him a pack of sisters, all of whom rather suspiciously have Irish names. You know, Patrick is from sort of Romano-British, so he's from Western Britain. You know, his name Patricius is the type of name from that region. The name Derrynane is a really old Irish name. It's a form of naming that had actually died out by the 7th century. So I think when we're looking at Derrynane of Valentia, I think she's actually a genuine saint, I would say, probably completely separate from the cult of Patrick originally, and who then gets tied into the story about Patrick. That name Darurca, that form, the Dar part of it, it's from an earlier form of the Irish language where it was used to mean daughter, and it's completely fallen out of usage. So she's made a sister of Patrick, and what's really interesting with Darurca is she's a rare example of a female saint who celebrated not as, dedicating her life to God as a nun, but as a mother. That's really rare in the Irish sources. So she is supposedly the mother of 19 children. And I do love it's the 17 sons and the 2 daughters. And then they said of the 17 sons, they nearly all became bishops. Which is slightly scary. But if you look at, I haven't traced all of them, but if you look at the sons and the daughters, they're scattered all around parts of Kerry. So it's sort of tying her story and her family into Christianity in Kerry. So it's a really nice example. I wish there was more material on her available than there is, but I think she gives us a little snapshot of sort of those early Christian traditions, and then they get incorporated into that cult of Patrick, which is sort of all-encompassing. I want to switch now a little bit to thinking about something that I mentioned a bit earlier, which is how saints can become part of narratives of political power. And we see this in the cults in South Kerry as well. One of the reasons being, I suppose, something fairly obvious is that by the 7th century, the church had become a really powerful institution. And it was an institution which attracted the patronage of local kings, local rulers, and members of those families would also go into the church. So it becomes quite aristocratic. And, it probably changes quite a lot in the 7th century. Now, in the case of that group I mentioned, the Owenucht in Loch Lane, so they're the kings of Westminster. They're like one of the most powerful dynasties in the region. We can see their involvement in the church through the cult of Fachlan, who gives his name to Inishfallen. In the Killarney region. And when I was coming into Cahersiveen from Killarney, I was deeply excited when I saw Inishfallen there, because apart from the beautiful, Annals of Inishfallen, that fabulous manuscript that was produced there and is now in the Bodleian in Oxford, where there's a lot of Irish manuscripts, it was also just great to see the place name, associated with one of the saints that I'm talking about. Now, what's interesting with Fachlan is he's the son of a historically attested individual, Eid Davon, the King of Westminster. He seems to be associated with their centre of power in Killarney. You would expect that cult to become really important, but it's almost forgotten entirely. It really only survives in the place names. And this is because he's so closely associated with that ruling dynasty that when they become less important, so does the religious cult. And, we see different things with different saints. So when we come to Crohan, he retains his importance even though the politics change. But in this case, you have a saint who doesn't retain his importance when the politics do change. And that area around Killarney becomes associated with a completely different saint. And this is really the most important saint in the region, and this is Fianán Caum. Now, the number of Finians and Fiannáns and Fionnáns becomes incredibly confusing. My colleague, Professor Paul Gregorian, who's one of the really fantastic expert on saints, I think threw up his arms and just said, look, they're all just one Finian. I do believe there are multiple Finians there, and some of them are separate individuals, and I think Fianán Caum actually is definitely a separate individual. He's a really interesting saints cult. There's a lot of questions I have here that I don't necessarily have answers to yet. And so in a way, I'm going to introduce you to some of my speculations more than anything else about Fianán. So he's very well attested. We've his genealogy. So his parents are from Corcaguina. His mother's from Corcaguina. His father's from Kirrigaluchra. So you've got that sort of North Kerry sort of genealogy. He's conceived in Loch Lane. I'll come back to that in a moment. He's educated by St. Brendan. So we get the area around Tralee included in the cult. In fact, if you were going to say who is the the most Kerry saint, it's actually probably this guy, because the cult is so extensive everywhere throughout Kerry. That rather basic Google map that I just put together yesterday, in fact, is just to give you an idea of the main areas that are associated with this cult in Kerry. There's a lot of place names, obviously St. Finian's Bay, not far from here. So his cult is really an important cult. He is most famous in sort of contemporary sources for founding a monastery in Offaly, Kinnity. It's a really fantastic site, beautiful high cross associated with it. But his cult is nearly entirely based in Kerry. So it's an unusual example. Brendan is the same thing, though. I'm wondering, is it a Kerry thing actually at this stage, where Brendan's main site is out in Clonfert in Galway. But when you think of Brendan now, you think of him as a Kerry saint, almost entirely. And if you look at where the main cult sites are, then place names, it's all around that sort of Dingle area. So something similar is happening with Fionnán. It seems to be in and around the 8th century that this happens. It's actually probably not coincidentally. It's around the same time it happens with Brendan as well, that these two Kerry saints who found churches elsewhere become sort of relocalized into Kerry. It seems to be around the same point. It's an era of political change. And one of the biggest changes that's happening is that group that I mentioned in around Killarney, the Onocht of Loch Lane. They seem to lose quite a bit of power. And the Kirkagwina, for example, become a lot more prominent. They begin to have more influence in Ivra. And the cult of Fionnán seems to come with that. And then the story of his conception in Loch Lane is like right in the heart of the power of that particular group. So the story is, it's like a lot of these Irish saints' lives. The stories can be fantastical, would be a kind way of describing it. So his mother is bathing in Loch Lane, and a salmon swims up into her womb, as they do, obviously. And then, Fionnán is conceived. And, you can see what they're trying to do. It's sort of the idea of him having this, miraculous birth. His mother is sort of being compared to the Virgin Mary, I suppose. But like in a lot of Irish texts, when they take those theological ideas, they tend to make them quite literalist, and they embody them, let's say. So that birth tale puts him into Loch Lane. And then, really interestingly, I decided just this week, in fact, I said, I really should reread that Latin life of him again. And it had been a while since I hadn't really read it thinking about Kerry and the cult in Kerry, which was a huge mistake, obviously. When I read it before, I now realise the entire life is about, and it's probably an 8th or 9th century life, the entire life is about, it sort of says, and he went to Kinnity. The entire life is about locating him in Kerry. Now, I need to do a lot more work on this, which is why I said I'm giving you my speculations, but there's something really interesting going on with his cult in Kerry, and this is the era when I think it takes off, and you can see now it's sort of all over the place. I didn't want to talk about saints in South Kerry and not talk about the saint in this part of South Kerry. That would have seemed really bad. So I wanted to say a few things about Croghan or Crohan, and he's a really interesting example of what we see, I think, in other parts of the country, where you've got a saint who primarily survives through the place names and actually through local devotion as well. It's not like Finian, who's got a life where there's important churches associated with him. You can sort of see there's a big political dimension in his cult. With Croghan, it's all about the local veneration. And you can trace it. It's really interesting. So it's, you've Kilcrohan Parish, you've got that whole area around Dunkerrin. But if you wanted to trace his cult, so I sort of made a stab at it just looking at the place names, it's really extending from around here up then towards Kenmare, and then it extends down into Cork, into that part of Cork, in Beara. And in fact, there they have a Croghan as well, who they think of as a Cork saint, but it's actually clearly the same saint if you just look at the geography of the cult. And it's an example of how modern county boundaries can be very misleading. He's obviously the saint of that area. If we didn't have the place names, and we didn't have the genealogies, we probably wouldn't know he existed. And it's an example of how relying just on, your sort of your saints' lives alone or your major texts will only give you part of the story. And it's why you do have to look at the landscape and you do have to look at the place names. And the place names are an incredible treasure trove in terms of trying to understand what's happened. And it's something which I think has become more and more, identified by scholars as being incredibly important. Now, in his genealogy, he is associated with quite an important saint. And again, he's a similar pattern to Brendan that I mentioned and Finian. This is St. Lochtena or St. Lochtan. So he's a church out in Freshford in Kilkenny, but the main veneration is actually in the Cork region. It's sort of in that Cork-Kerry region. And so in the genealogies, he's presented as Lochtain's uterine brother. So that means that they share the same mother, but they have different fathers. Then this is actually quite a common pattern with Irish saints, because the expectation was due to, I suppose, the fact that divorce was readily available. Also, I suppose, just people's life cycles. The expectation was that somebody might marry several times, and so that you could have siblings that were half siblings. But the relationship, if you had the same mother, was more important than if you had the same father. That's just a more serious relationship in early Ireland. So that relationship, and if you look at the geography of the cults, they're really close to each other. You can go from that sort of Cork-Kerry area, you look at the place names, and you can actually begin to reconstruct that cult and its importance. So for me, it's a really nice example of something we should be doing more of, rather than just relying on the main saints that you see in the text. Okay, I can see I'm running slightly low, quick in time, and I said, I promised myself that I would keep to the time frame, because if you're up first and you go on and on, you throw the entire schedule out. So I just wanted to finish. I know it's been a bit meandering, but I wanted to finish with just maybe a few thoughts, which is thinking about saints and their importance, but also how that changes over time. And what I really liked when I started looking at the South Kerry saints was you could really see that in the different cults. You could see that maybe a cult like Crochan is probably an original local cult. I would say the same with Darurca in Valencia. Then you get cults that are imported, like the one of Fianán Caum, that then becomes really important and dominant. So where a saint starts and where the cult ends can be very different places. Saints' cults can move. They can move across the country, and they can move around different localities as well. And it's really interesting to see how that happens. And sometimes we're lucky enough to have enough material between maybe the material, artifacts, and between the texts that we have, looking at the place names that we can reconstruct that. We can't all the time. In fact, probably most of the time we can't, but that doesn't mean it's not happening. I think this is probably the default way we should think about the cults. It's really linked with the landscape. I mean, that I think is an absolutely crucial aspect of that. And when you look at how cults move in relationship to each other, so when one saint's cult moves, another will often move. You see that with the cult of Lochtan and Crochan, where the cults sort of move together in tandem. And then the stories about the saints, and this is what I really liked about going back to that life of Fianán, and I wish I had done it a long time ago, I have to say, is it's the way the communities shape the stories of the saints. So we sometimes think about the saints as, that these are really powerful individuals, but their power actually comes from how the communities embrace them. So at the end, it's really about much more about the communities than it is about the saints. So that's all I have to say for you today, and thank you for listening.
Stay here. No, thank you very much indeed, Professor Johnson. Elva. That was most interesting, and me being a stranger in Kerry, I have always found it to be a very saintly place. So we have had reference to Finian, a number of Finians, Darurca, St. Brendan, and we know that living here that there are many other saints as well, St. Michael and also St. Bunya in St. Finian's Bay. They honour that saint too. So we'll just take a few questions. So thank you very much for a most interesting talk, and we know there's many more saints that we can get information on from this source. So thank you, Elva. So I'll take a question, a number of questions, if anyone would like to ask anything. There's a microphone there in the centre of this room and a microphone in the other 2 rooms. So if anyone puts up their hand, you can come to the microphone, please. Okay, you need to go to the microphone, please. Yeah.
I've actually got a lot of questions, so I won't ask them all and maybe get you afterwards. Just an explanation of why I'm so interested. I'm living on the west coast of Ireland. I'm obviously English from my accent. I've worked in monasteries for a lot of my life. And I'm fascinated by how monasticism came into the west of Ireland. I'm also fascinated by how similar it is to how Buddhist monasticism went into Tibet. So my questions are all around that. One of the things I noticed in the west of Ireland and in Western Tibet is the association of saints with particular caves or islands or places where they're known to have practiced. And would you say that those that have more local veneration, you know, and are remembered by local people are that kind of saint, that non-political saint, really? And I know in Tibet and where I am up in County Galway, they're also the saints that first brought the religion. Yeah, so I'd like you to comment on that. And the other fascination I have is where the monasticism came from, because Patrick refers to monks, so they were already here, right? So Christian monasticism, and my suspicion is Christianity came with monastics in the way that Buddhism came with monastics into Tibet. So, comment.
Really interesting questions. I'll start with the second one and then go back to the first one, which I think is a really interesting comment, actually, is, yeah, I mean, if I had to place a bet on it, I would say that you have to have substantial Christianity before Patrick. There's enough tells, I think, even in his own writings, that this is the case. I mean, there's a lot of debate about where you place him in the 5th century, and I would put him earlier. So I think, yes, and the type that arrives, that's a really interesting question. It does seem to be that it's that type of Christianity. I mean, partly it's, I think, just a very practical thing that the more traditional, you know, having your diocese and that particular setup just doesn't really work in Ireland because you don't have the urban landscape really to support it, or that civic landscape. And it's, I mean, one of the things that's been coming out, I suppose, a lot more is the sense in which there are so many sites that have to be quite early in terms of that association with Christianity. So I think that's a really, I mean, I wouldn't be able to be absolutely certain about it, but that's where I would be now in terms of how I would think about it. In the other one with the caves, you know, that's a really great point, because my mind started it sort of triggered me in a good way, because one of the epithets you get for several saints is that they're cave dwellers. So that appears in those martyrology texts. So they'll say, you know, sort of X of the Uv or Uvok. So you get that idea of the cave. The wells, obviously, that's just a huge thing. There's no getting away from that. So yeah, I think there is. I think there's different levels of how those saints cults operate. So there's the sort of the political end of it, which is, you know, your Patrick, you know, the sort of the whole. This was the institutional end of it, and then I think there's another layer, which is much deeper and probably in some ways more important, but not as well represented in the documents, which is that local level. That's why I think the place names are so important, because they allow us to at least try and reconstruct that better, because we're only seeing a part of the picture if we look at that upper end of it. We're missing out an awful lot of what's actually happening on the ground. But yeah, really, really interesting comments. Thank you.
And where did the monks come from?
Britain, I'd say. I think you're looking at the influences coming via Britain.
Not through the Mediterranean and up the west coast?
I think for the west coast, I mean, it is a difficult question. I mean, yeah, you could make an argument for what you're saying. You could point to the patterns of trade, coming up from the Mediterranean up through North Africa.
From the Desert Fathers.
Into Ireland. But I think in terms of, if you look at, say, now it can be difficult to reconstruct, but if you look at, say, Christianity in Western Britain, particularly in Wales, and you look at it in Ireland, there's a lot of similarities, just in the way it's organised, that whole monastic influence. I just think there's really close connections there. But it's more with that Western British side, I would say. And it's partly just because Britain becomes so transformed politically that we've lost a lot of, what was going on there. But that's what I would say.
Thank you. I know you have lots of more questions. We will go now to...
Sorry, just one second. At the risk of intruding on what is a very interesting discussion, just a purely housekeeping thing. There's a car down in the car park, a silver Toyota, 172KY795, which has its lights on. So there's going to be a dead battery there if it's not, if somebody doesn't visit. So it's a silver Toyota, 172KY795. Your lights are on and you run the risk of having a dead battery if you don't see to it.
Can we ask one question from the marquee, please? Can we ask a question from the marquee?
Yes, of course. Go ahead from the marquee, please.
Hi there. Thank you very much for that very interesting talk. You spoke about the maybe how modern people could be mistaken in drawing distinctions between saints and counties. The Kerry storyteller, Eamon Kelly, famously said that St. Patrick never came to Kerry, and how could he? The Cork people had stolen his donkey. So he stood on the county bounds and said, Baniam Oum Shirshiv, I bless you all from the west of me. We have three holy wells here in the parish of Cardaniel, Tubber Crahan up in Barnagiha and in the hill above us. I'm just wondering that in Cardaniel the water of the well is supposed to contain a cure for eye ailments. I'm wondering, were other local saints were there go-to wells for other ailments? As opposed to the cure for the eye in Cardaniel. That's the question.
Yeah, definitely. That's really interesting. And it's sort of something I probably didn't touch on enough is, yes, it's looking at the well names as well. That just gives you such an insight into where the saints are located. But yeah, well, like when I was growing up, so I'm from Limerick, and my mum's family is from East Clare. And the saint there is Shannon, Saint Senan, and there was the local, the well out in Clonlara where my grandfather's family are from. They had a little well there, and it was a wart curing well. It didn't work on me anyway. I don't know if I didn't have enough belief, but I ended up getting some awful chemical stuff, putting them on my fingers. But yeah, and you'd have that still a lot, I think, locally. The idea of certain wells are associated with particular types of cures, and a lot of the time it is those local saints. I mean, one thing which, again, I've a lot more work to do in it, but I've sort of started to trace it a little bit, is in the 19th century, some of the wells get rededicated sometimes to Patrick or to Bridget. But if you look back at the earlier place name evidence, and these are those types of healing wells, it's nearly always the local saint. So yeah, I think that's where they have their sort of superpower.
Can we ask a question from the AV room?
Yes, of course. Go right ahead, please.
Thank you. I wonder, could you comment on continuity between saints and pre-Christian belief? And I'm thinking of Finan, the Garrod O'Crulig spoke about, and the book of the Cailleach points out that in the earliest known manuscript of the poem, the Cailleach Beara, there's a prose note attached that says the Cailleach Beara was of the Kirkagina, and that she was allowed to continue working, as it were, with the permission of Finan. I'm also thinking that, you know, he's credited with creating Town and Ein. You get a lot of surfers nowadays in Boig and on St. Finian's Bay. That Finan credited that. He's associated with Leachtanine at the site of Drung Hill, which is, you know, a pre-Christian burial place originally. So there seems to be a land-forming landscape thing, and even the place names. I mean, Derrynane, where we are, is a Finan place name. So that land-building, almost earth goddess function of saints does seem to be a feature.
Yeah, that's sort of a really, you know, interesting comment in terms of, you know, as you said, the continuity with, you know, with the pre-Christian past. I mean, one thing that we definitely know that the church does, because they tell us in early medieval documents, is that they'll identify a site which is associated maybe with, you know, an important pre-Christian ritual, or maybe with a supernatural figure, and then they'll rededicate it to a saint. And there's a famous letter which it's involved in the story of the conversion of the English, in which the Pope of the time writes to the bishop who he sent over there, and he says, and you know, the bishop writes to the Pope and sort of says, "What am I going to do? They're worshipping all of these gods," and he says, "Just go out to the places where they worship them and where they have the festivals and find a saint." And so they definitely do it. I mean, they tell us that they do it. And, you know, I don't think it's any stretch of the imagination. I know some of my colleagues would be less comfortable saying this than I am, I'll be honest. They're sort of afraid of saying the word pagan. But I just don't see that there's any stretch of the imagination really in seeing that places that are of importance, extending back before the time of Christianity, retain their importance, but then associated with a saint. I find that very, very plausible.
Okay. Thank you very much indeed, Elva, for a most interesting talk. I know there's many more questions. I'm sorry, we have to move on now to our next speaker. Thank you again. Bula Bosmore. Thank you. Our second speaker this morning is Dr. Nessa O'Connor. She is Assistant Keeper of Antiquities in the National Museum of Ireland. Dr. O'Connor has degrees in archaeology and early Irish history from UCD, and a doctorate in governance from the law faculty in Queen's University in Belfast. She's a native of Fossa, so is right at home here in Kerry. Dr. O'Connor's grandfather was Joseph O'Connor. He was one of the first inspectors of schools to be appointed after in 1922. Nessa's talk today is about her grandfather, his work in folklore, and the history of South Kerry. He spent time in Ballinskelligs and stayed in the Segerton Arms Hotel in Ballinskelligs, which was under the stewardship of the Main family at that time. He wrote a book, which I haven't read yet, but I will, called The Norway Man, and other publications as well. So, Dr. Nessa O'Connor.
Mary. Is Bralam Van Shaw, son oit Iantach Starul Shaw. And thank you so much, Morris, and everybody on the committee. I'm delighted to be here, and thank you for your wonderful welcome to everybody. So we're coming forward now quite a long way from the period that Elva was talking about. We're right up into the 19th and 20th century. So Joseph O'Connor was born in 1877 and died aged 80 in 1957. So he's my grandfather, but I never actually knew him because he was dead before I was born. So though his family home was at Fossa Killarney for 50 years from 1907, much of that time he also spent in Ballinskelligs. So the reason he's of interest to us here, I think, is as an observer and recorder of lives lived in Kerry as early as the mid-19th century, when he recounts the stories of earlier generations. He did so from the perspective of a fluent Irish speaker, also versed in the classics and modern languages from the 3 years he spent studying for the priesthood in Maynooth, and with the skills of a competent artist and writer as well. Most of all, he seems to have understood the value of the folk traditions of the area, Kerry generally, but in particular Ballinskelligs. So I suppose he's of local interest primarily, but also He lived in the context of a very particular social, political, and cultural milieu. Now, I'll just come forward here. So here he is in front of Maine's Hotel, where he always stayed in Ballinskelligs. I think this photo is from around 1929, 1930. To the extent that he's remembered now, it is as the author of two books, which Mary mentioned one of them, The Norwayman, 1949, and Hostage to Fortune, 1951, which was also republished in 1989. Hostage to Fortune is an autobiography. The Norwayman tells the story of a young newly married island-dwelling couple who find a shipwrecked Norwegian and nurse him back to life to share the complexities and trials of their isolated island lives. Some of the detail betrayed, however, that it was based on a real location, even though it was fictitious. And in Joseph's introduction to his book, this is the introduction, brief introduction. The bay of this story is any one of the 100 salients the Atlantic has thrust into the land between Shannon and Fastnet. It is so like the others that the reader who knows that austerely beautiful coast has a wide choice of background for the tale. Mike and Moira, Thade and Joni and the rest have lived so intimately with me for the past half year that I shrink from denouncing them for the figments that they really are. But I can say this of them. They are composite of the friends of my youth, whose lives covered the end of an old world and the beginning of a new. Bannacht de la Hanuman na Garad. So although he anonymizes the people and the location, on rereading it myself, just getting ready for this lecture, it's fairly clear to me that the location is very much based on Ballinskelligs, Horse Island and Carrasiveen. And Carrasiveen is very slimly disguised as Cahir Sally, so no mystery there. It seems, and I've heard this myself, maybe 25 years ago when I started going on holidays to Ballinskelligs first, some locals thought that they recognised themselves in the characters in the novel, in particular the less reputable characters. So I'm told that for a while Joseph was persona non grata in certain quarters in Ballinskelligs, which might explain why I recall when I was a child, I was always told that it was set in the Blaskets. So that's kind of, I think, that was a myth that was put out. So he was a lifelong Irish language activist and advocate. He was founder of Craibh na Harna in 1898 in Killarney, only the second branch of the Gaelic League to be established outside of Dublin. He wrote in Irish for An Goom and the folklore journal Bealidus, as well as some unpublished papers and drawings that we'll come to now in a moment. So, Hostage to Fortune, his 1951 autobiography, there it is, consists of 33 chapters, each one of which is both historical narrative and unique story of people and ways of life in Kerry. Some are tales of people that he encountered while doing the rounds as a schools inspector, like the woman he met way up the mountains in the Kinmare-Kilgarvan area who had survived the sinking of the Lusitania, or the Chicopee Reel, which is the story of a lost piece of music, which was hailed by Benedict Kiley in his book of short stories as one of the finest short stories by an Irish author. So they'd be the main published works. Joseph O'Connor was born in Warley, Essex in 1877, where his father Daniel was stationed with the 10th Lincolnshire Battalion. This was certainly not any kind of a career choice. You know, there weren't career choices, I suppose, anyway at the time. But because Daniel, his father, along with his family, had been evicted on small Christmas Day, 1863, from their tenant farm at Knockmail, Dua, some 6 miles from Listowel. His father's oral account of that eviction is recounted in detail in Hostage to Fortune, along with his father's encounter with a recruiting sergeant on the streets of Tralee that sealed his destiny. The Lincolns went overseas in the mid-1860s, and Daniel, now this is Joseph's father, saw service on the island of St. Helena, South Africa, the Straits Settlement of Malaysia, and by 1869 his military record places him in Yokohama in Japan. So you can only imagine the effect of all that on a young man born before the famine in Dua. It was quite an extraordinary experience for him. In 1875, he was home and married Joseph's mother, Elizabeth, a Wilmot from Church Street, Listowel, from a family of blacksmiths extending back to Cromwell's time. It was there that the large family returned in 1886 when Daniel had reached the highest rank open to non-commissioned officers, that of Regimental Sergeant Major, and decided to retire. Joseph lived in Listowel from the age of 9 to 13 because his father found employment on the newly constructed Lartigue Railway that extended from Listowel to Ballybunion. In 1890, When Balfour's narrow gauge railway was completed, connecting Tralee with Dingle, Daniel became the first station master in Dingle, having learnt the trade on the Listowel to Ballybunion railway. Joseph thrived as a teenager in Dingle, educated by the Christian Brothers, with any spare time he had spent in the harbour, swimming and going out to their farthest fishing grounds with the Longs, who were a fishing family in Dingle. So as he wrote of it in Hostage to Fortune, I think maybe it bears repeating, although I'm not quite in South Kerry yet, I'm getting there. My schoolboy interest was centred on its harbour, this is Dingle, and waterfront. That harbour was, for me, the most exciting stretch of landlocked seawater in the whole wide world. It had everything. It had a fleet of hookers sitting at anchor or tacking out to sea with brown sails set. It had a long sandstone pier studded with bollards, flanked by boat slips, and thronged by carters, hucksters, manxmen, and arklow-men. And the smells it had, tar, seaweed, slob, fish, and strong tobacco mingled with ozone and sunshine into a stimulating blend that makes your blood tingle with Derrynane dew. It was from here, from Dingle, that he got his first sight of Ballinskelligs and Ivora as a 16-year-old, when he went off to sea on a trawler on a trip with the Longs to Bantry in about 1894. The Longs wanted to replace the ballast on their boat with barytes to give more stability to the vessel in time for the highly competitive Dingle Regatta that was sponsored by Lady Ventry. He has described this trip in Hostage to Fortune, and this is his first encounter with this part of the world. We made a beeline across the harbour for the Skelligs, which lay 20 miles to the southward in the glow of a westerly sun. We reached them by sundown and went into Ballinskelligs Bay to anchor for the night in the lee of Horse Island. I was surprised to see a constellation of lighted windows on the mainland where I'd expected a dark, sparsely inhabited coast. It looked like a town lit up for the night. That's the cable station, Joe Long told me. There's hundreds of Yanks and Scots and Englishmen working there. Graffers, they call them. A gay crowd up to any divilment from pitch and toss to horse racing, and free with their money. Should they get it easy? If we weren't in such a hurry now, we'd go in ashore for a sing-song and a dance. Now, I know this was 1894 because later on in the journey, they and their boat got arrested for getting in the way of the Dreadnought, the famous British naval ship, naval type vessel of the time that was performing practice manoeuvres on the Kerry Cork coast. So the next stage of Joseph's life, just very briefly, took him away from Kerry on his mother Bessie's choice of life for him as a student for the priesthood, not his own. It was probably some time before he saw Ballinskelligs and Ivora again. Having excelled in secondary school, he spent 3 years on a diocesan scholarship between St. Brendan's College, Killarney, where he was later to teach for almost 30 years, and St. Patrick's College, Maynooth, where he spent 3 years. Some 6 years into his career as a teacher at St. Brendan's, T.W. Russell at the Department of Agriculture and Technical Instruction, and Horace Plunkett, famed for his involvement with the Cooperative Society, Agricultural Reform, had decreed in 1904 that science and art were to be properly taught in secondary schools, principals receiving a circular telling them to get their teachers to attend these summer courses. So that's how he became a student of Sir William Orpen at the Dublin Metropolitan School of Art, spending each summer on these courses until at least 1917. There's a rather fascinating account of his encounters with Orpen in Hostage to Fortune, but I don't have time to divert now to that here. But he was taught as well by Oliver Shepherd and the painter Leo Whelan. One of his fellow students was a very young man from Limerick, who Joe describes and tells us that he was to become Orpen's favourite, Sean Keating, wonderful portrait painter of men of the South, the Aran Islands, Ardnacrusha, and so many others. And he says about being chosen for that art course, I was delighted. I'd inherited from the Wilmots an eye for form. They were all good at freehand drawing with slate pencils on the forged floor or with red-hot iron on the anvil, and like good provident parents passed the talent on to me and my brothers Eamon, Donal and Vincent. So I've just cut a whole piece out here because it's too long, but he also had an association with a man called R.H.A. Willis, who became head of the Dublin Metropolitan School of Art. And Willis was an adopted Kerry man because his wife was a Twiss, a sculptor. But he came to a sad end, unfortunately, because he brought a visiting artist to Ballinskelligs, and they stayed in the Sigerson Arms. And pulling up the boat up, they went out to sea to fish, and putting the boat up in the evening, the tide was out, and he overstrained himself, and unfortunately, he died that night in Ballinskelligs. He was said to be a big loss to the artistic world at the time. So Joseph married young, a few months before his 23rd birthday in June 1900, and it was that marriage that brought him back to Ballinskelligs on regular visits ever after. In 1917, William Main of the Sigerson Arms Hotel in Ballinskelligs married Ellen O'Leary of Ballyhar near Killarney, a close cousin of his wife Catherine. For the next 40 years, Ballinskelligs became the focal point of his working and creative life, always staying with his great friend William Main at Main's Hotel, using Ballinskelligs as his base for school inspections and as a free time retreat as well to pursue his interests in the Irish language and folk traditions. They were both widowers together for many years, up to the time of Willie Main's death in 1949. As well as the two books mentioned, he also wrote for the Capuchin Annual, the Irish Press, the Irish Independent, and as well as writing, he drew sketches, and many of his articles have sketches in them as well, about the wonderful characters and storytellers of the Ballinskelligs area. Many articles written by Joseph are scattered through journals, newspapers, books, and some of them are quite difficult to find. And even as I was preparing this over the last couple of weeks, I was finding new sources and new publications that I hadn't heard of before, such as Vexilla Regis, the Journal of the Maynooth Laymen's Association, and the Irish Bookman's Review or something. I found another one there. Anyway, moving quickly on and bearing time in mind. So there is a notebook that he kept during the month of September 1927 in the collections of the Irish Folklore Collection Archive in UCD. And I want to acknowledge the assistance of the National Folklore Collection in allowing my access to my grandfather's notebook and manuscripts, and as a source of the images that I present here also. So I'm just going to show the most relevant pages from the notebook. The first thing we're looking at there on the left is the dedication when he eventually presented it to the Folklore Commission 27 years afterwards in 1954. He presented it through Sean O'Sullivan from Tuassist, a former student of his at St. Brendan's in Killarney, who was a full-time folk collector in the area. So on the right then we have one of his sketches, which is of a cross-inscribed slab near Kilreelig. Now, he did document archaeological and historical sites to an extent, but he was far more interested in the people who created the monuments, their skills, their language, and their lore. There are drawings, just move on here. There are drawings, notes, and observations in Irish, for example, on the visit of a Norwegian scholar, Ole Mork Sandvik, to Ballinskelligs and Kilreelig. This is all 1927, all September 1927. Sandvik seems to be a remarkable man, and his story was published by Professor Seamus O'Cahan in this book that we're looking at now, Gaelic Grace Notes. And I suppose the way in which I found out about the notebook was because I saw this book and the cover, which is one of my grandfather's sketches, and his initials underneath and the date. This is his sketch of Sandvik, who actually seems to have had a remarkable life. He lived from 1875 to 1976, so he was 101 when he died. So the notebook of 1927 must surely mark a connection to Joe's novel, The Norwayman, that he wrote more than 20 years after the 1927 meeting with Sandvik. There's quite an amount of Norwegian language dialogue in the novel, and one wonders, he must surely have had recourse to the Norwegian friend that he made all those years before. And just move on to the next one. This is the actual sketch in the notebook that Seamus O'Cahan used in the front of the book, but he has Sandvik's address and everything up on the top, and there isn't time now to go through all the Irish, but in that page that we're looking at, there's detail of how they went out to sea, out beyond the Skellig, and it sounds actually as if they were sick as dogs, as far as I could make out, but he talks about Lochathorrig, the Atlantic, and underneath the sketch of Sandvik himself, he has Thros go Loch Leach, which is Loch Corran behind Waterville, on the 11th of September 1927. And elsewhere in the notebook, there's an account of how Sandvik sang Norwegian folk songs on that trip, and somebody else responded and sang local songs. So then we have his sketches of the great Sean O'Connell, who I imagine most of you will probably have heard of, the great Shanachie. And So, he did these kind of characterful sketches, but at the same time, he was always interested in recording the Ivra Irish for not just the people, but the things that were around them in the house as well. Like in this case, we have the spinning wheel in the house. And on other pages of the notebook, he writes about other crafts. He was very keen to record the particular terminology in Ivra Irish for the crafts and tools. So that's another one of Sean O'Connell. I'll just come back to this one. When James Hamilton Delargy, or Seamus Delargy, founder of the Irish Folklore Commission and first Professor of Irish Folklore at UCD, made the long journey on foot from Ballinskelligs to Kilreelig on one of his last visits to the great Shanachie, Sean O'Connell, he was accompanied by Joseph O'Connor, both of them carrying bicycle lamps to light their way on the dark road. Joseph documented that visit in his final article in the Capuchin Annual, The Last of the Shanachies, published in 1958, the year after his death. Laura Hioni Connell, 1947, represents the stories collected between 1923 and 1931 from O'Connell by Delargy, documenting the oral tradition of Ivráthach, Delargy's greatest work. From Joe, and I say Joe and Joseph in, one, they're both used, but he was most often called Joe. From the article, I quote, "As we reached Kilreelig, an tú sanna Hamish, Sean asked through the dark," this is Sean O'Connell, "Is me hana a cheáin, is tá de cheana chara Joseph im cheanta an trosa." Seamus had told me how far the story had gone at the previous session and had shown me with the light of the bicycle lamp the last sentence he had written in the notebook. Sean will begin with those very words tonight to link up the story and will carry on in the same words and sequences from the last time that were used the first time he heard those stories 50 years ago, never written down, all oral tradition and from memory. I noted the sentence that Seamus showed me. "Ná leg the rún le manoi, dá oilacht I. Give not your mind to maid, though fair she be." Here's my grandfather's evocative description of O'Connell. "Sean O'Connell was a great man in every way. In his old age, he stood as straight as a pine tree and as hard of limb. He held his head high in any company, the large-boned head of an ascetic, lit up by a pair of steady, untroubled eyes. Sean O'Connell was by common assent the last king of the Shanachies of Prior. Sean Cormac O'Shea was his premier, Micheál Conry his personal attendant, Piazzo Chiala his bard, and Tommaso Croneen the thorn in his flesh, who sought to tarnish his crown with venomous wit flung from afar. Tomás lived alone and apart from the others in his bahán beside the road at Dungagan, a small, podgy mannikin with a roving eye and a wonderful memory for salacious tales of the great houses, which he told with vicarious enjoyment. That's the house of Sean O'Connell. That's another sketch. Anyway, so now we come on to Tommaso Croneen. So here is Tomás's house at Dungagan, and underneath, again, there's a whole lot of Irish that I haven't time to go through, but underneath it says, "An Ulskull, Tig, Tomás O'Connell." But now, I don't think he was being in any way snide or anything. He actually had great time for Tommaso Croneen and seems great respect for him. And from the notebook, it seems he spent quite a lot of time with him. Elsewhere in the notebook, there's things like 2 to 5 o'clock with Tommaso Croneen, and you could just see him going in the door of his little house there. And here he is, very characterful portrait of Tomás himself, Tommaso Croneen. I actually found him in the census because sometimes you'd be anxious to be sure that you kind of second check your sources. And he seems to have lived with his mother, his widowed mother, and his sister. So Joe's most extensive article in the Capuchin Annual was Kerry Roo in the 1950 to 51 edition, a kind of literary and historical tour through the barony. There's a section on O'Connell country, just to make it more relevant to us today, in which he sings the praises of Daniel O'Connell's grandmother, Moira Dove, who bore him 22 children. And he also made a journey to the Skelligs, this is Joseph now, with the renowned German photographer of the time, Adolf Morath. And Morath's photos illustrate that article, images from throughout the county. But he does speculate on the fact that according to him, there was very little tradition and lore about O'Connell himself. And he remarked in the article that there was far more lore and tradition about the O'Connell women. So that's not a bad thing. Joseph had started out writing in Irish long before he wrote his novel and autobiography. Mind you, he had a rather caustic view of An Gúm, and not without a certain sense of humour. He wrote 2 books for An Gúm with a view to second-level art instruction. One was Sór Mós Trí na Hidóile, which was published, and Tosach Alina, which was not. In Hostage to Fortune, he comments as follows. I'll just read it quickly. On the day the Russians turned on the Germans at Stalingrad, An Gúm accepted for publication a much-needed textbook on art with 200 illustrations in line and colour that took as long to draw as the book to write. Before I had discovered for myself and heard from other innocent Gaelic writers of the constipational practices of An Gúm, I sent in another manuscript on the Italian masters, which was accepted and put in cold storage 2 days after Rommel's defeat at El Alamein. And frustrated by An Gúm, I turned to English. So Irish writing first, then the Norman Men and Hostage to Fortune and all the other articles. Just as a slight aside, and I won't be too much longer, his early interest in English literature was first fostered in Listowel, and a couple of years before his death, in an obituary to the Listowel bookseller Dan Flavin, who had so encouraged his reading and lifelong interest in literature, he was bemoaning the fact that he was probably Flavin's oldest disciple still living. And he quoted Dan saying to him, whatever he was reading at the time, "Throw away that cheap rubbish. All it'll do is ruin your taste for good English. Here, try this book by a new writer who really knows his job and tell me what you think of it." Flavin had managed to procure the first few copies to reach Kerry of a new writer's book, hot off the presses for the first time. Treasure Island by Robert Louis Stevenson. So Joe had a rather extraordinary network of writers and scholars around him, developed through I suppose, a network to do with the Irish language, educational focus, folklore and political connections and work. The Capital Annual, edited by another Kerry man, Father Senan Moynihan, brought him into an intellectually stimulating arena that included the modernist poet Thomas McGreevy, later director of the National Gallery, the writer Benedict Kiley, his Listowel cousin Seamus Wilmot, a writer too, registrar at UCD for a time, Maurice Walsh, author of The Key Above the Door, Black Cock's Feather, and others. He had many students in St. Brendan's College, Killarney, who figured prominently, including Fionnán O'Lynch from Carrick-Siveen, who was mentioned yesterday, teacher, 1916 leader, Minister for Education in 1922, later Lascown Corla, and Circuit Court judge. John Marcus O'Sullivan, Minister for Education, later in the 20s, he was briefly his student as well. And indeed, Redmond Prendeville, to bring a little bit of GA into it, we have to do that in Kerry, the famous Kerry footballer of the 1924 All-Ireland, subsequently Archbishop of Perth, who had been expelled from All Hallows College for jumping over the wall to Jones's Road to play in the All-Ireland, and he was thrown out. In Joe's, that was Redmond Prendeville, in Joe's own North Kerry family background, he was also a close relation of both the playwright George Fitzmaurice and the writer Gerald Griffin, author of The Collegians and poet. There was J.J. O'Kelly as well, born in Valentia Island in 1874, Skellig, as he was known, appointed Minister for Education in 1921. And he called on Joe to come to Dublin to assist in the preparation of the second-level art curriculum at that time. Fionnán McCullum, who features in the notebook, he was the one, Fionnán McCullum was the great Conor na Gaeilge man. He established it in London and became the main fundraiser in the United States through Douglas Hyde. And Fionnán McCullum, who actually organised that trip to La Couronne, it's in the notebook, the one where they took Sandvik out, he was a first cousin of Fionnán O'Lynch. So there's all more Finians and Fionnán's Elva. Joe's greatest admiration was for Seamus de Largy, Seamus an Giulla, as he called him in the inscription in the notebook. De Largy, and I was just going to flip through a few more pages of the notebook as well, just very quickly to give you a sense of it without going into any detail, given we're stuck on time. This is a good example of his attention to detail about particular crafts, in this case seafaring. These 2 pages are where he noted down the specific technical words in Irish for all the different parts of the boat. And it's a boat belonging to Seamus McGarrett of Horse Island, so that's interesting to know that as well. And the drawing, and that's Tomás O'Cronean's little house again. And this is attributed to him in the Folklore Archive, but I don't think it's Ballinskelligs, although it's not a dissimilar house type to what we were just looking at for Tomás Ó Crónainn. That's the forge, pritchels and stamps and all sorts. And that's the account of Sandvik and his visit and walking with him to Kilreelig, and also the exchanges of Norwegian and Irish music. Now, this is an interesting one. Delargy and Joe stayed in touch over all the years, and Delargy often visited him in Fossa. So this is a photo of Joe on the right with Walt Disney when he visited Ireland. Delargy brought him, he was going around Ireland collecting stories for his films, and afterwards, every Christmas, he received a Christmas card from Disney until his death. In Vexilla Regis, he wrote an article entitled 10 Green Bottles about the 10 Kerry men, including himself, who entered Maynooth in 1895, and how he encountered them again in his teaching and inspectorship. Some in South Kerry, one memorably who had been dispatched to Salonika in the First World War, Father Alexander O'Sullivan, who actually features in the ambush at Ballymacandy that Owen O'Shea is interested in. Father Sandy O'Sullivan was dispatched off to Salonika in the First World War, only to find that his Maynooth Greek was of little use to him there. And I'm really just coming to the end now. Sorry? Yes, yeah. He wasn't involved in any kind of party politics himself, but through his Irish language involvement, he and his connections, he did posters for Arthur Griffith in the Sinn Féin elections of 1918, and the newspaper archive I found very useful as well because of the detail that's provided there on events like funerals, for instance. As I finish, he also reported quite a number of objects to the National Museum where I work, just shooting through some. There is the Derrynane trumpet on top for another day. I won't stop to go into any detail on that. Quite a lot of mention of Fianán Ó Lynshí, and Sister Delord Stack of the Presentation Convent in Carrisaiveen was a great friend of his as well, who often read his work in Irish for him. So I'm going to finish pretty much as I started, returning to him in the place he loved best. And I will leave you with the last words to him from the frontispiece of a series of manuscripts that he presented to the Folklore Commission. It's to do with the Irish speakers in Slieve Luachra and near Killarney that were the basis for his paper in the Journal Beilidus in 1945 called On Rudatá Rome. And it reflects very much, I think, on his approach to his work. And he says, first of all in English, to the most knowledgeable person, that which is now before me will be here after me. To the most knowledgeable person, I leave the sifting. And as he wrote it himself, an rudatá Rome, beg sé díagse, ag an nuine is ólach fógam an críre. Gríomh míle maith.
Many thanks indeed, Nessa, for that very interesting talk. It wrote between folklore, art, history, the sea, all over. So just a few questions now. I suppose we'll try and keep them very brief, please. So I'll go to the AV room, see if there's anybody in that room or in the other room first, please. Anybody coming through? Anybody here? And Taharo Shukru, I'll call you, so please just go to the microphone.
Thanks, Nessa, for that enlightened talk on your grandfather. I was privileged to know him because I was a small boy in my scoilbhairstugrie, na rahannig sé isteach chun an scoil chun cigareacht a gginmh ar an scoil. It was in 1940 or 1948 that I went to school, and it was either 40 or 41 that he came, and I think it was his last journey, or his last visit to the school anyway.
Yeah, was he retired in 1942, so that would figure,
Yeah. I also had another connection with your family. I was appointed to Birmingham Diocese in 1960 after I was ordained. And one of the priests that I got to know was your uncle, Father, I forget his name.
Father Donal.
Donal,
Father
yes.
Donal O'Connor. Yeah, yeah.
And
It's lovely to hear that.
I met him. He was in the potteries. I was in Stourbridge, which was famous for its glass.
Yeah, yeah.
And he was in the potteries, famous for its famous for Delft, yes.
Yeah,
Delft.
yeah.
Thanks.
Thanks very much, Father Sugar. It's lovely to hear that, because it's very rare now to hear anybody who actually knew him. Thank you.
Is there any question from the other room, either the AV room or the other place? No. Another question from here, please. Okay.
Hi, Nessa.
Hi, Mary.
I realised we're cousins because my grandmother was second cousin to George Fitzmaurice. Her name originally, before she married, was Johanna O'Connor. And her cousin married George Fitzmaurice's father, the vicar in Listowel. And that made me think about the connection with Dwall, where I'm from. Dwall was one of the last places in North Kerry to lose the Irish. And if you read George Fitzmaurice's play, you can see the idiom. The Irish is very influential in the English being spoken there. And I wonder, would Joseph have spent much time in Dwall in his youth, and would that have influenced his love of storytelling in Irish and that sort of thing?
Yeah.
But I'm glad we're cousins.
Because that's close enough now, actually, because he was the second cousin of George Fitzmaurice.
Yeah.
George Fitzmaurice's mother,
Was
Winifred,
O'Connor.
married, the Parson Fitzmaurice,
Yeah.
George Fitzmaurice as well. And her father and my great-great-grandfather, they were brothers.
Yeah.
So we're definitely the same O'Connors.
O'Connors, yes. Yeah,
And thank you for putting me straight on the pronunciation
Of Dwall.
I was calling it Dwall.
Thank you.
Thanks, Mary.
Okay.
Thanks very much.
I think we'll end a great morning session now with that, and Ruth is going to come and talk about the arrangements for coffee and after, please. Thank you very much. A big boola bus now for Nessa. Thank you, Nessa.
Mary, thank you so much. I think we can now claim that the O'Connell School is where connections are made. Wonderful, wonderful connections there. So could I ask you, if you're in the AV room, would you stay there for your coffee? If you're in the marquee, would you stay there for your coffee? And please, if you could be back in your seats by about 20 to 12, it would be much appreciated. Thank you.
So for this session, we're going to have two speakers. Now, we did plan the session to have... Sorry, thank you, everyone. We'll get started with the next session because we all, I suppose, want to get done in time for our lovely lunch. So we plan to have 3 speakers in this session, but we're reduced to 2 today, and Alan Power sends his apologies. But we hope that in the future we will hear from Alan about Derrynane Gardens as well. So just to give you a quick introduction, my name is Eleanor Turner, and I am the Biosphere Officer working with South Kerry Development Partnership on the Kerry UNESCO Biosphere Reserve. And I'm moderating the session today. And more importantly, I suppose, the more important thing about me is that I'm one of the people that was very fortunate to be able to say I've lived in Cardaniel my whole life and I grew up here. And I've had access to this treasure that is Derrynane National Park 365 days of the year. And so I think I'm very blessed and honoured to be invited to moderate the session today. So our first speaker that's going to join us at the session is the unique horticultural legacy of South Kerry. So for our first speaker, we'll invite Dr. Michelin Sheehy Scaffington. Now, Dr. Scaffington is a plant ecologist who taught botany in the botany department of NUIG Galway. And she specialises in wetland ecology, turlows, flood meadows, and peatlands, and has published widely on these subjects. She's been a long-time member of the Botanical Society of Britain and Ireland, and she's responsible for recording plants in the southeast Galway for the BSBI's Atlas of 2000 and 2020. Now, she also has a long-term interest in Ireland's Lusitanian flora, and has published papers on a number of them, including the Kerry lily. And it is the beautiful Kerry lily that she will share her knowledge on today. So thank you very much for joining us, Doctor, to share the secret history of the Kerry lily.
Thanks very much. It's great to be here in the seat of O'Connell Power. As you just said, I'm a botanist, so I'm dabbling in history and things that I know less about, and I'm looking forward to maybe comments and discussion at the end about what I reckon is my story about what I think is the Kerry lily. So the Kerry lily was first found in Ireland in 1848, and this is about the time that people were first finding the more rare species in our flora, because the commoner ones had already been documented over the previous centuries. So it was found in Kerry, and it was known only in Kerry for a long time. And that meant that it was a pretty rare species. So in more recent times, when Wildlife Acts were enacted in the 70s and more recently, it was protected under the Wildlife Acts. The most recent list is the Flora Protection Order 2015. So let's just have a look at it. It was not only found only in Kerry, but it has only ever been found right here in this part of the Iveragh Peninsula. So that makes it extremely rare and quite unusual. And this was for about 140 years. And then quite recently, relatively, in 1987, another population was found just across the bay. And I think the sea is over there. Just across the bay from here, right, near Kilcatherine Point. And that was the known extent, and quite recently, only 4 years ago, it turned up on a roadside near Castletown Bear. So it is confined to this area, and it's for that reason that I'm here really today, and why I'm focusing on that. That's really a very unusual distribution for a plant, for a wild plant to occur. So let's just look at how that translates out. I'm a member of the Botanical Society of Britain and Ireland, and you can see that in these islands, the atlases are mapped on a hectad basis, which is a 10 by 10 square, and that is the sum total in southwest Ireland of the distribution of the Kerry lily, and has never been found anywhere else. Now, the more astute of you might spot that there are 2 dots down here near Bournemouth. And coincidentally, it actually was found in 1847, a year earlier, in that part of England. And it was in a pine plantation, maritime pine, and it was always thought to have been introduced, in fact, with the pine trees when they were planted at that time, and there were 2 populations. But it actually hasn't been seen there for nearly 100 years, so it's considered now, again, extinct, but they kind of didn't take it seriously. Botanists are really, gripped by whether something is native or not, for conservation purposes. And so this was kind of thought not to be native, but the concentration then of the Kerry lily is right here in southwest Ireland. So where else? How else can it occur? Where is it globally? This is a really unusual small point in the world, if you like, for the Kerry lily to occur. And this is its full distribution. It's essentially a European species, and it's confined to the southern Atlantic regions of Europe. As you can see, it's across the north part of Iberia, north part of Spain, and the northwestern part of Portugal. And also then it extends into the Landes region in France, and up through Landes in French is the French for heathland. Their heathland's quite extensive there. So it's quite a western distribution, but with a southern inclination. And you can see then that the Kerry lily here is quite an outlier. What's it doing up here? But as such, it's one of the species that has a lot in common with Iberia or Lusitania. There's an old word for it, which doesn't just encompass Portugal, but encompasses a lot of the Iberian Peninsula. And the Irish botanists are particularly proud of having a lot of Hiberno-Lusitanian species. And that's species that occur, their main population is centred on Iberia, and then occurs in Ireland. And of course, we're proud of the fact that the British don't have them. There's about 15 of them that occur here that are not in Britain. There's a few others that are in Britain, and the subject for many more talks. And in fact, I've studied one of them, in particular, Mackay's Heath. And if you look at the distributions, the detailed distributions in the landscape, you can unlock some clues as to how they might have got here. And botanists have long expressed how did they get back here after the Ice Age, or how did they get here after the Ice Age. It's quite clear they weren't here during the Ice Age or the tundra conditions after that. And there's been all kinds of theories about that. But I worked on Mackay's Heath. I might talk about that a little later, but how it got here to the west of Ireland, because there is a population not far from here, and I suspect the O'Connells are implicated in that as well. But I'm talking about the Kerry lily here. So how might the Kerry lily have got here? Why has it got this so-called disjunct distribution? It's stretching it a bit, obviously, to call it a Lusitanian species because it's relatively extensive in France, but it still has quite a stronghold in Iberia. So let's go back to this distribution. Very odd that it's confined virtually to the mouth of Kenmare Bay. But also from a botanical point of view, we're used to seeing plants with a very narrow distribution confined maybe to a north-facing cliff on a mountain, so something hanging on maybe from when we had tundra conditions and has kind of disappeared, or maybe something confined to a particular rock type, maybe ultra-basic rock or some other type. But the Kerry lily occurs all along the coast, right here, either side here, in heathland, which is the dry, heathery landscape that is all over here. So it's full of heather and the western gorse, which is the smaller gorse. Now, we're not short of that on the Iveragh Peninsula. We're not short of it on the Beara Peninsula across the way in County Cork, southwest Ireland. And indeed, there's plenty up in Connemara and Mayo if climate isn't a limiting factor. So why is it only in this area? This has really struck me as quite interesting, especially having worked on the heathers of Mackay's Heath in particular. And so myself and my partner, Nick Scott, have been working on these and talking to people. And I have a former student, Rory Hodd, who's actually responsible for recording for the Atlas for Kerry. So he knows the areas from Killarney. And he said, oh, you know, there's somebody who's been working on the Kerry lily. So I said, who's this? And that was Darragh Lupton, who I knew, and he was working at the time in the 2000s in the Botanic Gardens in Dublin. And of course, the conservation unit there is interested in what are Ireland's rarest plants and how can they best conserve them. And the Kerry lily was obviously top of the list as one of the ones that is very much confined to a local area. So he had some students do some survey work and map it in the area. But also what he was going to do was to study the genetics, because when you're trying to conserve a plant population, it's important to know whether if the genetics is variable in a population. If the genetics is variable, then it's likely to be adaptable to changes in the environment, climate, or a habitat of some sort. Some of the plants will be adapted to this change, and it means it's much easier in a way to conserve and maybe even also to grow on. Darragh then, this was in 2009, he did the work, he did a report for the Heritage Council, but then he got a job in Oman, setting up the Botanic Gardens there. As you might guess, this is his Twitter page, the picture of him there. So he kind of didn't get to publish it, and I wrote to him, and I said, Darragh, I've heard about this work, you know, and he says, yeah, I wrote it up as a report, and I never got round to publishing it and kind of had other things took over. Luckily, as you can see, he has come back just this year to take up a post of curator in the Botanic Gardens, so maybe there's hope to do some more work. But in the meantime, what I'd heard and what he told me then about his genetics work was quite interesting. So just to give a background, they sampled as widely as they could. 126 plants were sampled over the 5 main sites, divided up 4 different sites around here, around Derrynane. It also occurs in Castle Cove area further up the coast in the east, and the one known site near Kilcatherine Point at that time, because the other site near Castletown Bearhaven hadn't been found. So they sampled widely, and they also looked at the genetics as widely as they could, taking 21 regions, 17 of them chloroplast regions and 4 of them nuclear, in order to see how widely they could search for variation and differences between the different plants and between the different populations. So the results were actually rather surprising, and it struck me straight away. They found no variation at all in the gene regions screened. So that's quite unusual. Like from a plant population basis, what it means probably in this case is that it's not that long in Ireland. Because if something's been here for thousands of years, you'd expect that different populations would have minor mutations and there would be slight variations between the different populations of the plant. So it implies that it's relatively recently arrived in Ireland. But the other thing implies that it has come from one source. If it had come from a whole load of different populations, it would be already genetically variable, but it doesn't seem to be. So this is a mystery that still hangs over. We don't actually know the full story about the history of the Kerry lily, so we need some more help with that. But it did trigger a number of things in my mind, and cue Derrynane. And I took this picture from the website Derrynane House. It's an interesting painting. And what struck me was it's a very maritime-oriented picture. You can see Derrynane House situated, albeit in a rather romanticised landscape. Lamb's Head is looking particularly forbidding there. Out to sea with a romanticised Abbey Island, and you can see that there's a clipper out to sea, and if you can hold that image of this boat out beyond the rocks and the islands there, I think that's important. So it shows it had very much an aspect of maritime activities, if you like. And how does this translate? Well, of course, there are no boats nearer in. The boat is out to sea because the arrow that you can see there points roughly to where the house is, and right in, as you all know, it's quite sandy, it's too shallow, boats don't come right in up to here. But you can see all around Lamb's Head in the south there, it sticks right out into the sea. Abbey Island there in the centre, it also has deep water around it. And then into the north and west of Abbey Island, you can see that the Derrynane Harbour also has some relatively deep water. So if there are boats, they would be accessing it around there. So what's this got to do with the Kerry lily? Well, there's the distribution in this area of the Kerry lily. There are more further towards Castle Cove, but this is the sole populations of the Kerry lily in this area. And you can notice a number of different things. First of all, maybe just even looking at the Lamb's Head populations, they're very much coastal, even in a very coastal environment, and they're focused in on certain sections of the northwest coast of Lamb's Head. Abbey Island is where the students found the headquarters, if you like, they had the biggest population. It's obviously widespread around Abbey Island, and also quite an extensive population, or maybe groups of plants in around Derrynane Harbour. But notice how that's all associated with the deeper parts of the sea within this inner bay on this side of Lamb's Head, bar just one there in the southeast. But the other thing is, if you explore it, and we went round looking at it, and you look at the maps and all that, you'll see that each one of those populations is associated with a secluded little cove. And that's what the arrows are pointing out. There's 2 up here in Derrynane Harbour, one fairly treacherous looking one on Abbey Island. Again, I'd like information maybe on that. And then 2 in Lamb's Head. And the same applies to the ones further east in Castle Cove area, that there are little secluded coves associated with them. So what do they look like? Derrynane Harbour here, I just took a quadrat here. It's the Kerry Way in the middle distance there. So the Kerry lily is right here, and you can see that there's a cove very nearby. Now you can see again, that's the heathery landscape that is everywhere around here. So the habitat is widespread in the area, and there is no ecological reason that I can find that the Kerry lily would be confined to the areas where it is only found, because there's plenty of this heathery habitat. Now, I'll come back to that. I'm not going to talk about the plant communities or the conservation, but I've actually got an important point to make, perhaps at the end, about its conservation, but that is its habitat of choice. Now, the one on the right, the Lamb's Head one, is the southernmost one. And of course, as a lot of you know, there was a big fire in Lamb's Head, so there's still quite an area of burnt soil in that. But the Kerry lily is adapted. It's a southern species. It's adapted to fire, and it came back after the fire. And the red arrows show a few of the plants there. But the main thing is, there it is on the top of a low cliff overlooking a very small, secluded harbour. There's a little quay there, some of you may know it. And again, in, out of the open seas. So that's really gives some clues as to maybe how or what might it be associated with. So I'm going to focus on Maurice O'Connell, Hunting Cap O'Connell. He had that name, as you probably all know, because he didn't like to wear, I think it was raccoon skin, which I find odd, a kind of cap which was taxable. He wore something else. He didn't like paying taxes. And he inherited Derrynane House, and assume he was living here from 1751 on. He was obviously born here as well. And the O'Connells were just one of many families, as I'm sure most of you know, up the west coast in particular, that had a lot of trade with the continent. They had a maritime aspect, as that photo, my photo of that painting showed, trading with the continent openly. Now, they're Catholic families. They can't get employment of positions of power in Ireland or Britain, so they have family contacts in Catholic Europe, France, Spain, Portugal, Italy, and they're trading all the time, hides and wool coming from Ireland, and they're obviously importing things from the continent, including alcohols and tobacco and things like that. And most of this was open trade for centuries. But there was also, like, the taxable things like alcohol and tobacco were kind of traded, and the revenue couldn't really get at them for a lot of the time. It was kind of a tacit thing that was going on. There was a fairly open amount of ships and boats coming and going like that. But around the turn, or the middle of the 18th century, towards the end of the 18th century, they began to start to narrow things down. The revenue were trying to tighten up on trade, particularly with things like spirits and alcohol. And indeed, Hunting Cap himself was charged with smuggling. And the note I say charged, he actually got off. There's a whole story there, which you probably know. But that shows that they were trying to arraign people with, who were known for importing things, perhaps without paying the taxes. So just maybe, if you'll bear with me, Michael McDonagh's book on the life of Daniel O'Connell has this quite evocative piece, and if you'll bear with me, I'll just read it out, because I think it kind of summarises where I'm going. The dangers of the rock-bound coast of Iveragh and the wild and tumultuous seas which surround it prevented the revenue cutters from maintaining a strict watch for smugglers. Yet even if one of these obnoxious craft appeared on the scene, it dare not follow the light smuggling vessels into the bays and creeks of West Kerry with their intricate and dangerous entrances. It had, perforce, to remain outside in the open sea, while the smugglers, knowing every channel, glided safely between the treacherous ridges and sharp points of rock, invisible beneath the rolling waves, and were soon at anchor in the quiet waters of the coves. Now, thanks to Paul Henry for his rather fanciful painting, but I think it rather sums it up, and that's something I'd like to know a bit more about. Clearly, there was a bigger boat that had come from somewhere, and we have actually a description which I use for my Mackay's Heath work of near Achill, just the bay in behind Achill Island, where Robert Maxwell, the traveller, describes a boat coming in, staying offshore, anchoring offshore, and dozens of small boats coming out from the coast, going to the boat and taking the smuggled goods and bringing them back in and sequestering it into small coves. And I think this is the kind of thing that would have happened. So these are small boats that would have taken goods off another boat, Then you see the revenue commissioners cutter might have turned up, and they can go straight in and go into these small coves. And a lot of them, as you know, are really treacherous. It's really hard to know how to get in around the rocks, but they can do that fairly quickly. Curraghs seem to be the obvious one. Might have been curraghs with sails, it might have been pucons, it might have been all different types, and it'd be nice to discuss what kinds of boats they might have used. But the main thing is that they were landing them in remote places. They're not in a place where there's a quayside. And I just want to take the one at Catherine Point, just to the east of Catherine Point. The red arrows there show where the Kerry lily has been found in that area, just a small collection of plants population there. And you'll see there coming from the arrows that there's a small track already in that 1845 map. So there's a kind of track running down. And the other thing you'll see, maybe you can make out, it says natural arch. And there's a bay coming in, and then there's a kind of a piece just near the end of the word natural. And in the satellite image, that's what it looks like. So you can quite clearly there see the bay, and then there's the arch, which is green. And then there's another inner bay there. And the two arrows then are pointing to the two places. The dotted line means we couldn't find the Kerry lily actually on one of the ridges, either side of where you can see the track has now been prolonged, but it still is in one of the others, right next to this bay. Now, the farmer there gave us special permission to go in, so I can't say to you to go down to see this natural arch. He doesn't really welcome lots of people, hordes of people, or people going in, and certainly we got permission to go down there. But you can take it from me that this is what it looks like when you get down to the natural arch, and you can make out the arrow there shows you can just about see the sea through this arch. And it is possible, we've looked at it, it is possible that a small craft would come in at a high tide, and it could obviously find a really sheltered place to offload any kind of illicit stuff. The cutter could be way out to sea. You're not going to get into that at all. And the key thing there is that the Kerry lily is only 50 metres uphill on the hillside. So to me, that's something where the Kerry lily is telling you something about what the people might have been doing, rather than the other way around. I'm learning about how the Kerry lily might have come through what people were doing. So how did it get here? I'm not for a moment saying that the O'Connells or anybody else were smuggling the Kerry lily into Ireland. I'm certain, in fact, that they were not aware of it. Well, the thing is, I've talked to Connie Kelleher about it. She's a shipwreck archaeologist, and of course it's known anyway that goods that would be transported in ships would have been packed, and the archaeologists call this packing dunnage, and it could be bits of wood or other things they find in their shipwrecks, but also there's no better material than heathers. It's springy, it's malleable, you can use heather material, and as you can see from the picture from Asturias in the north of Spain, heathland with heathers and western gorse are right across that whole area. And actually, Peter Foss, who worked on yet another of these Lusitanian heathers, the Irish heather, the Mediterranean heather, said that in the 80s he actually saw boats using heather material as packing in northern Spain. And we've actually been relatively recently, and we found an old couple collecting a whole load of heathers and bracken as bedding for their animals, because they still bring their animals in because they've got wolves, so they need bedding. So heathery material was very much in use, probably for millennia, and certainly for centuries, and still is to some extent. But the other thing is that the Kerry lily grows among these. There is the Kerry lily in its autumn colours. It has a very bright orange leaf at this time of year, and it's growing right there with the heathers. That could have been taken right here. It's the same heathers, the same western gorse, the same species. So the idea is that the goods smuggled into remote coves, which we've kind of, my guess is, around Derrynane, would have been landed, perhaps with their packing still. I don't know what the material, how they landed the goods, what goods were. We can guess that there was alcohol most likely. And at least that there might have been seed left from the packing which might have remained on the boat. And the other thing is that these goods, if you saw where they were on Abbey Island, Lamb's Head, they were landed straight onto the heathland. So they're taken, from a heathland area, and they're landed straight into that. There's no stone quayside, there's no roadway, there's nothing. They're brought straight in, perfect habitat, germinate and grow. And that seems to me the story as to how the Kerry lily came here, was through smuggled goods. There's a lot of questions as to why all these areas, what exactly is it, why are they so genetically uniform? We might discuss that later, I haven't got all the answers. But the other thing is, where did it come from? We don't know, do we? Because we haven't got the diaries of the economists from that. But I have an idea that it came from Bordeaux. And I was talking to, well, I was emailing Brian Crowley, who a lot of you probably know, who's researched the history of Derrynane House, and he says he's fairly certain that a lot of the smuggled goods would have come from Bordeaux, particularly the alcohols, the spirits and the alcohols. And you can see there, Bordeaux in 1822 is still quite a rural landscape, the River Garonne down the middle, and you could imagine that goods were brought to the quayside, packaged probably already, you know, so that they were in larger bundles and brought to the ships, and the ships were then sailed off northwards, in our case, towards southwest Ireland. But the other thing is, of course, that Bordeaux, as you can see there, is right in the northern part, but in the heart of where the Kerry lily occurs. There's a patch of heathland north of the Garonne, and there's plenty of it south of the Garonne. So it's quite possible that one of the consignments, I can only think it was one of them, there was heathers and that gathered from somewhere in that area and to use to load up the ships, and then this material was brought here. But I don't know, because we haven't got any proof yet on that, and we need some more research to be done. So just in conclusion, I suppose to say that detailed investigation of plant distributions, plant species, and knowledge of their ecology can unlock some historical things. They can tell the historians or even archaeologists things that maybe they hadn't quite twigged. And in our case, we learn a lot by learning the history of what people were doing at a particular time. And of course, the Kerry lily story, I think, exemplifies that. But the next thing to be done is really to do further genetic studies. For one, I think Darius himself would say, well, 2009, we can improve on the methods, we can improve and maybe see maybe there is some variation within that, but certainly use modern methods to study the Irish populations of the Kerry lily, and of course then to study them on the continent. And there, it's a bit harder to say, well, where do you start sampling? And that's why I think Bordeaux, it's great to have a key place like Bordeaux, further north and Nantes, and that there's not so much, but maybe looking at sampling the population on either side of the Garonne, and then in various key port areas in northern Spain and perhaps in Portugal as well, and to see if the genetic makeup, the genetic pattern of those populations, which ones might more closely resemble the Irish populations, and to see whether they are where we might be able to get a clue as to where the Kerry lily came from and where the goods that were landed in surreptitious ways at that time. And I suspect it's the 18th century that it came, but again, I have no proof. And then just to say, dunnage material, as the archaeologists know, can give valuable clues and throw up more clues even than we think, because Connie Keller has said, oh, I need to look at that twiggy material we found in one of the ships a bit more closely, because that's probably heathers as opposed to wood. So that's the story as it is. I'd like to have some discussion. I want to thank a lot of local people who've helped me, and open it up to the floor. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so much for that. That was absolutely fascinating. I love how, as a plant ecologist, you've managed to be an explorer, an investigator, and everything on the journey looking for the Kerry lily and discovering its past. So I'd like to open it up for some quick questions. Is there anyone in the other rooms that are with us today that have any questions? If we leave a moment and see if any come through. And then if you have a question in this room, if you just raise your hand so I can find you.
We have a question from the AV room. Question from the AV room.
Perfect. Go ahead.
Hello, thank you, Micheline, for such a very nice talk.
Sorry, we couldn't quite hear that. Can we go again?
Yeah, thank you for a very nice talk. Could you ask you to put a picture of it up on the screen?
That's right at the beginning here. I didn't have, when I was doing my field work, it wasn't in flower, so I didn't get some good ones, but Rory Hott managed to get a couple. There. So it's a small little plant. It's only about a foot high with these delicate little flowers, and it's really only seen in the springtime, June, July, if you're asking about how to recognize it.
It's a beautiful little plant, isn't it? So we have one question here in the room. Thanks. If you'd like to introduce who you are as well before you question, that'd be great.
Mary, when I was in Derrynane a number of years ago, I would have seen it in Abbey Island. But in recent years, I haven't seen any evidence of it, even though I visited it in June. So I'm just wondering, is there any reason for its non-visibility? Please. Thank you for a lovely talk. Thank you.
Great, I'm delighted you asked that, Mary, because I could have given a botanical talk, and I'm actually quite concerned. I mean, in some ways, botanists are going to now say, well, you mean to say this isn't native, so we shouldn't be protecting it? I think it's a very iconic Kerry species, so I have no doubt that it should be protected. But as you saw perhaps in the Derrynane Harbour picture, where it was near the harbour, it's really in tall heathers, and I found it quite hard to find just off the Kerry Way in the Derrynane harbour area, and I found it really difficult. We both searched Abbey Island up and down, and Abbey Island has got really tall purple moorgrass in the hollows, so it's hard to, I'm not that tall, but still the purple moorgrass is quite tall. And then if the heathers are also quite tall, it's going to be shaded out. It's a very small species, really, relative to heathers, as you probably know, can grow up to a metre tall. So I think that some of it is disappearing on Abbey Island is probably to do with management, and maybe there should be some more grazing. Winter grazing is always a great way of controlling heathers, because there's not so much other things in flower. Overgrazing obviously is another story, but I think there should be more grazing by cattle or by sheep or both to keep the heather down. In other areas, I suspect that the land has been virtually abandoned. In the Castle Cove area, we only found it on one rock in a sea of purple moorgrass. So there has to be, perhaps where possible, and I think Derrynane House has some control over the grazing of Abbey Island, but maybe to look at some of the populations around the Kerry Way. I wouldn't recommend fire. I don't like fire. I know it's a natural way of controlling vegetation, and heathlands are naturally adapted to it. Heathers are naturally, and so is gorse. But obviously that's quite a difficult thing, and you're burning and killing insects and things like that as well. And most notably, the accidental fire that set fire to most of Lamb's Head at one point. But that did mean that it came back, but I did see that some of the peat had been burnt in one of the places where I thought it should have been. It had disappeared. So I think there's issues to be discussed about management and seeing that there is an appropriate habitat. It grows on the shallower peats, the heathland, not the deeper bogs, and the ridges, which are everywhere here with the old red sandstone, that to make sure that there's a certain amount of heather, but that it's not too deep, and that the Kerry lily can grow up within that. So yes, I think it's the maps are all the records, mostly Dara Lupton's students, and all the records people have found it on Abbey Island, for example. But I don't think those squares represent what it's like there today. Probably needs to be remapped.
There's a question from the AV room.
Hi, thank you very much. It was very interesting. Just a quick question. Do you know what is it called in the continental areas that it grows? Is it called the Kerry lily there, or is there a different name?
No, it's not. It's not. It's called the Kerry lily in these islands. I should know the French word for it. It's something which describes its flat leaves, planifolia in Latin. It's lis a feuille plate or something like that. There's nothing about Kerry, anyway, that I know of, either in Spain or in, which is understandable because it's, as you saw, it's quite widespread there. But we call it that because it was first found there and it was only known for around here for ages. So, the Kerry slug is another example, except that it's also now turning up quite a bit in Cork, the Cork and Kerry slug. But as you see, the Kerry lily is quite more local. So no, it's not There's no recognition. And that's also, I mentioned the Mediterranean heather, as we call it, because it's supposedly Mediterranean. It's actually mostly in Spain, but it's also known as the Irish heather. And this is because it doesn't occur either in Britain. So, I'd love some comments about, the smuggling methods, the history, hunting cap. Could it have been him? Is that, if anybody knows anything more around the methodology, if I like to say, of how it might have been brought here and when, it'd be great to talk to you afterwards. If not now.
That's fantastic. Thank you so much for answering those questions. I'm sure we have many, many more, but unfortunately we're going to have to push on to our next set of speakers so that we're ready in time for our lunch. So I'd like to invite up James O'Shea and Chris Maguire to give their presentation now. And thank you so much for that, Micheline. It was really fascinating. So thank you, James. Up you come. So James is our head gardener here in Derrynane National Park. And we have Chris Maguire as well, who is joined us from New Zealand. So welcome.
Right, thank you very much, Eleanor. And thank you all for coming on behalf of the OPW. Chris here and I are going to give a quick presentation on the garden landscape at Derrynane.
So as James said, we're going to give a quick presentation, and I've been here for about the last 3 years, so it's a landscape I've got to know a little bit. Not as much as James, who's been here a lot longer than that, but it's a pleasure to be here today and stand next to James and tell you a little bit about the garden. So,
who's going to do the?
I'll click screen. So, firstly, James is going to talk a little bit about the historical botanical landscape.
So, in O'Connell's time, we feel that there hadn't been much ornamental garden, but they certainly had a vegetable garden, which you can see had been there on the slide on the right-hand side. And there were still the signs of the old potato garden when I was here first, when we were mowing the grass. We had to go over the humps of the old potato. And on the left, you can see where the old orchard was. Now, there were still a few apples and pear trees when I was a kid, but they were all gone by the early 60s. And there was also a small glass house down at the end that was there in Fa O'Connell's time. I've seen it in old photographs. But as regards plants from O'Connell's time, there would have been an avenue of beech trees, which are showing in the photograph on the left. There was also the elm trees, the English elm, which is almost extinct in Ireland now, but the English elm was obviously here from O'Connell's time. It's gone from Dutch elm disease, but we have it here still. And also there was there would have been the odd tree we see here, the evergreen oak, home oak, which was from obviously O'Connell's time introduced. And there was the story of a turkey oak out at the front of the house, which supposedly O'Connell planted on his 5th birthday, they say. But as it happens, it blew over in a storm in the 80s, and we counted the rings, and sure enough, they corresponded to about 1780, which would have been the time he planted it. It was a huge old tree. I planted its offspring there in its place, which is growing well now. But we used to always curse the tree because it shed so much leaves in the autumn that had to be cleaned up. So I'm sure the new one will be shedding when I'm gone, and I'll be cursed as the old fool who planted it. It should have been left alone. But so that's the history of. Oh, there was also a mulberry tree as well. Sorry, as you enter the gardens under the tunnel. Now there's only a portion of it there. It blew over in the same storm in the 80s as well. The old tree was a huge old tree, but the part that is showing now is a branch that had fallen on the tree. So that dates from even before O'Connell, I would think.
I can't confirm or deny whether you'll be cursed, James, at this point. So we'll move along. The house and land of what is now the National Park was given to the Irish state by the O'Connell family in 1964. And the national park was officially opened by President Carroll O'Dalig in August 1975 to mark the 200th anniversary of O'Connell's birth. And the photograph on the left here shows you the extent of the park, which is approximately 120 hectares. It includes woodland and the sand dune system to the foreground you can see. And the house is situated in the middle with the woodland behind and Abbey Island to the left, as I'm sure you're all aware. And the photograph on the right is just a nice shot of the house nestled in front of the wildflower meadows and with the woodland behind.
So in the early development of the gardens, I came here in 1978. Dan Keller was the superintendent at the time, and we just were doing clearing and cutting grass and that. When Cormac Foley took over in the 90s, he encouraged more development of the gardens, and he was followed by Chris O'Neill in 2013, and he has been very helpful and encouraging as well in the development of the gardens. So, and also at the same time as Cormac took over, we got two permanent staff, the Moran brothers. Actually, Michael began in 2000, or in the early 1990s, and his brother John in early 2000. And with a permanent staff, we began developing the gardens with more planting, opening up paths and general development. So in the early 1990s, as part of the South American conifer conservation program with the Edinburgh Botanic Gardens, which was done by Martin Gardner and his crew, the idea was to grow endangered conifers and other shrubs that were in danger of extinction in parts of South America. So they go out and collect a seed, mainly, germinate them, and hand out small seedlings to various parks. And we chose South America because, as you may know, some South American plants do extremely well here, fuchsia, escallonia, all those. It's often Andean plants that have the same climate as we have, damp and wet and mild. So we did get quite a few of the conifers, which are doing well. There's a few examples of them. This Fitzroya croupizoides is in danger of extinction from forests being cleared for agricultural use in Chile and Argentina. And there's the Prometheus andina. It was known as Podocarpus taxonomus. They're always changing their names just to confuse us. So Prunopitis is called now anyway. It's the Chilean yew, and the other two in the slide on the right are Podocarpus salignus and Saxigothea. They're all in danger from logging companies mainly. So that's why it's so important to have a pure strain. Again, if they became extinct, they could be reintroduced back into South America. And Martin Gardner and his wife came back actually to check how they were doing several years afterwards, and he was pleased with the growth, and he even took cuttings of them back to Scotland, so that was pleasing to us. And what's next?
So as James has alluded to, the climate a little there, we'll touch on that again. Derrynane, I suppose you could consider to be a microclimate with infrequent frosts. This is influenced by the Gulf Stream, as you all probably already know. Atlantic storms are a factor. They can bring damaging salt winds. This is particularly if it's the early spring and a lot of our deciduous plants are just opening and they can have damage to their new foliage. When the wind is veering northerly, that's when it's at its most damaging. It tends to funnel through and affect some of our larger trees. You won't get long periods of warm temperatures above 20 degrees, but you probably don't need me to tell you that in the summer. However, that can affect some plants flowering. Derrynane has a nice consistent rainfall though, which is perfect for gardening and the garden here in Derrynane. And that mild climate has contributed to a few invasive species becoming prominent here. I'm just going to touch on two of those. One you may have seen in the garden, Gunnera manicata, the big elephant ear plant that dies away in the winter. And also another one would be the Chilean hard fern, Blechnum chilens, which is becoming quite widespread here, as I say, due to this mild climate. And James was just going to say something quickly about that as well.
Oh, yes, because even though we do say we're fairly frost-free climate, we have had our few freezes. When the first extremely harsh one we had was in '87 when I lost all the tree ferns that I had here, plus any tender plants. It was a freeze from the east that dropped to -12 minus 15. You know, but that is unusual. But then again, we had, as you all remember, I'm sure, 2010 to 12, the harsh winters that lasted a few weeks of extremely low temperatures, and all the tender plants went again. It even split the bark of South American and African and Australian plants. Even I couldn't believe how harsh it was. And the final one was the beast from the east, as you remember in 2018, where we had snowdrifts, which hardly ever happen here again, and so many plants were damaged or killed. And that's why we always try and keep seed or cuttings of the more tender stuff, because you often have to replace them again if you do have those freak occurrences. But overall, we are mild and moist.
So, sitting in New Zealand, having made the decision to move to Ireland in 2018, I was watching the news and thinking, what sort of a forsaken place have I decided to move to? But things have been better since then. So, now, let's go on a brief tour of the garden by showing some of the images of the plants according to their place of origin. And firstly, I will highlight some Australian and New Zealand plants because they're more relevant to myself. And then James will talk about a few of the other plants that are interesting in the garden. And all of the photographs on the slides have been taken in the garden. And so we have a few shots here. On the left, Dicksonia Antarctica Grove, which is a nice part of the garden. A recently installed seat there is a nice place to sit. And those are Australian tree ferns, surrounded by some interesting palms. And I included the slide on the right because it's one of the most sheltered and warm and sunny parts of the garden. It's also fairly free draining, so it's the best place, you could argue, to keep the most tender plants here, and they'll be the most protected. And there's an array of things there. So, on the left is Cordyline Casper, as it was long known, and that's actually an Australian and New Zealand native species found in the Norfolk Islands, which is actually an Australian territory, also native to the Three Kings Islands, which is a group of islands north Island of New Zealand. Subsequently, actually, it was found on the North Island itself in the North Cape and some of the surrounding islands as well. It's an interesting form, similar to Australis that you would see commonly around here in Ireland and clogs up your lawnmowers. So, Callistemon on the right is one example there. Laevis is the species of many different callistemons that James has planted here over the years, and they all do well. They're all Australian. And so on the left here, we have Xanthorrhea. Some of you may know it as the grass tree, or can also be referred to as black boy, and that is a very tender shrub that can be subjected to frost, and it's also very slow growing, but it's a nice addition to the garden. It's a beautiful form. And one of the acacias that grow here is melanoxylon there in shot, and it's an interesting tree, and one of the nice features of it is the fact that it flowers off-season in February and March, so you get nice yellow flowers at a time of the year where you wouldn't have so many other things flowering. So my native New Zealand, one of the shrubs that James has grown in the garden here is Brachyglottis repanda, and it's also known as Bushman's toilet paper, or the postcard tree. So both uses in the past, self-explanatory. Actually, the photograph in the middle there is a purple form of that same plant, which was originally discovered in the Whangarei National Park, which is a very large national park, and that's actually the part of New Zealand that I came from to come over to Ireland. So it's a nice thing to have in the garden. James tells me it's quite rare in these parts. Also, the yellow flowering shrub there, you may have seen before. People would call that a kawhai tree in New Zealand. The small-leaved kawhai here being the hardier species as opposed to the large-leaved kawhai. However, we have the large-leaved kawhai here. We are propagating it. I collected seed from New Zealand around the Lake Taupo region, and we're hoping to plant that out in the garden too and hope it thrives and survives. Also, various different pseudopanax or lancewoods do well here. And you've got the most commonly propagated, I'd say, in Ireland, Lawsonii, which is in the bottom left, and also Crassifolius, which is in the top left there, which is a nice form similar to Ferox, which is slightly rarer next to it. You have Latus down the bottom, which is the more broad-leaved pseudopanax there, which is a nice species and seeds prolifically. There's also a selection of ferns in the garden, other tree ferns as opposed to the Dixonia ferns we saw in the first picture. Some of New Zealand's 7 native and Cyatheas, should I say, and 3 native Dixonias grow well here in Derrynane. And one of them being the New Zealand silver fern, which I'm sure you've all seen symbolically, and Cyathea delbata. So Dixonia squarosa and Dixonia fibrosa also grow here. Dixonia squarosa is an interesting tree fern in New Zealand because in the north part of the North Island, it's often used as a fence. People will cut the trunks and tie them together with wire and set them in the ground, and they actually will grow again away from the sides of they call them panga fences, panga logs. So.
We also have African plants as well. There's just 2 examples here. On the left is Wachendorfia. It's a bit of a mouthful, Thricifolia. But I got seed from a girl student we had here, Sally, when she was in Tesco in the south of England. She sent me some seed. It's a tender plant, but it throws up this big tall spikes of yellow flowers. It's quite spectacular. And it comes from the same part of the Cape as Agapanthus and Watsonias, all those plants that do well here. Any ones from the Drakensberg Mountains in South Africa are happy here, wet. And on the right is a plant from the Ethiopian highlands. It's Impatiens tinctoria, a very tender plant, but it throws up its growth each year and dies down in the winter. Now, if you have any frost at all, it gets killed, but it just hangs in there. And next, oh yeah, you've moved a bit ahead of me. Here are some Central and South American plants. On the left is Myrtus leclerriana. It's completely covered in white flowers in early summer. It's not to be confused with the myrtles you see everywhere else here in the gardens. That's the Chilean myrtle with the cinnamon-coloured bark that flowers more in the late summer and autumn, and seeds everywhere. Birds eat the seeds, excrete them, and they're everywhere now. In the centre there is a very tender climber called Cobea scandens. It's the cup and saucer plant, it's called, because the flower is like a cup in a saucer. It's a vine. It's hard to get established because slugs can eat it down completely when it's on the way up. But once it's established, it'll grow up through trees. It can grow 20 meters, probably can sprawl all over the place. And on the right there is the Chilean fire tree or fire bush, Botryum coccinium. It's a handsome plant. It flowers in the summer and looks well. In the center there is Crinodendron hookerianum, also a Chilean plant, even though it's called the Chinese lantern tree, which causes confusion, but it's because the flower is like a Chinese lantern. And on the left is another form of it, Ada Hoffman, which is a paler pink. You don't see that too often. And on the right is one of the butylons, which is also a South American shrub that flowers profusely and for a long period in the summer. It's worth having. And more South American, on the left is an interesting plant. It's an epiphyte that grows in Chile, Argentina, and Brazil, I think. But it isn't too exciting until it flowers, because it's just plain green. But when it's coming to flower, which is at the moment, the inner leaves go a deep red, so it's quite striking. And in the center is a blue flower, so it changes completely. It's eye-catching at the moment. On the right there is a tender, extremely tender plant, and it's an endangered species called Dendroceras from the Robinson Crusoe Islands. We got that from Billy Alexander's nursery in Ballinskelligs, and it's been out for a winter or two anyway. We'll see how it does. I'm sure if we have a freeze again, it'll be gone forever, be unheard of again, but who knows. And a few more we can grow quite a few plants from Canary Islands and Madeira. On the left is a shrubby, a foxglove, Isoplexus. It flowers on and off all the year until frosts come, and then it stops flowering but stays growing. In the center is one of the echiums. I'm sure you all know the echiums, and now they're everywhere. The big tall one from Alabama in the Canary Islands, that's Echium pininana. But the one in the slide there in the center is its cousin. It's more a shrubby one with denser flowers, and it flowers heavily in the summer, and it's covered in bees, the way the other echiums are as well, because bees love blue flowers. And there's a form of the Echium pininana on the right there called Snow Tower, a white one that we got a seed of just for a change of color. And two more Madeira plant, Derrynane madurens there is like a form of the common herb Robert that you probably know in the hedgerows. So it's just a giant form of it. It grows a rosette in the first year and throws up a big spike of flowers in the second year or third year, and it dies off then. And on the right is a shrubby form of the south thistle, which is a Canary Island plant, extremely tender. Again, if you have any frost at all, it's gone. So we always keep seed. And speaking of the Isoplexus again, which by the taxonomists is changed back into a digitalis, which is the foxglove genus. That's a more tender one than the Canary Island one, Madeira. It's their a national flower, I think. I've seen it on T-shirts in Madeira anyway. And it's a beautiful orange, brick orange flower. I'm afraid that the slide there is of it in seed. And then on the right is that just an example of a few palms, but there's the Phoenix canariensis, which is the Canary Island a date palm. Slow growing here, I'm sure you've all seen them in the Canary Islands, but big tall trunks. Our one is slow and it'll hardly ever produce dates. And finally, one from Madeira again. It's sort of herbaceous Melanoselinum decipiens, but it throws up these fabulous flower heads again in the summer. They're covered in bees and hoverflies and flies of every kind. So it's a good plant for biodiversity, and it's happy here.
So after having a tour of the garden there, I thought it was important to mention the Green Flag Awards that you all may be aware of. And Derrynane National Historic Park is a recipient of the Green Flag Award since 2016 and still currently holds a green flag. The Green Flag Award is a scheme that recognises and rewards well-managed parks and open spaces. So the criteria of a well-managed park include some of the points on the slide here. And actually, Derrynane was the first park in Munster to receive the award, as I said, back in 2016. So things such as a clean, well-maintained park, good environmental management, biodiversity and community involvement all are included in the Green Flag assessment. So it's conducted by independent assessors, and yeah, we're proudly holding the Green Flag Award. I thought I'd mention this briefly. Many of you are obviously already aware of Daniel O'Connell and Frederick Douglass's association, so I'm not going to go into detail on that. But interestingly enough, in 2018, a distinguished African-American documentary filmmaker and civil rights activist, Dr. William Smith, screened his documentary that he had produced in Derrynane House in the AV room. And at that time, took the opportunity to plant a blue atlas cedar that you see here in the picture on site. And it was a nice sign of solidarity and just an interesting way that Daniel O'Connell's influence is still being felt in the garden.
And we are also involved in coastal dune management, so we graze the dunes in the winter and to encourage a diversity. But we have a student, Andy Turtosney, who's doing a PhD for the past few years, and he has asked us to square off these squares on the dunes where the animals can't graze. We electrify them, and to see the difference between the squares where the cows can't eat and the parts that they can eat. And what he found almost instantly was in his squares where the animals haven't eaten, the biodiversity goes down instantly and the stronger grasses take over. But where the grazing is, you have far more flowers, basically. So we have a fine array of wildflowers, including orchids, the bee orchid, pyramid orchid, ladies' tresses, and the marsh orchids, plus a whole array of other wildflowers. And also, we graze Abbey Island, Micheline. As we speak, that there are animals on it eating. So, and that had improved the Kerry lily, we found early on. I'm not so sure, perhaps we hadn't been grazing it hard enough. And also, I think a bit of judicious burning, as you advised, would, I'm a combination of the two. But it's doing okay there, I think, again. So that's good to see. And also, as in the slide there, choughs which are a protected species of crow, are doing well because of the grazing, because the sward is low and they eat. They can more easily eat the insects they need on. So you often see flocks of up to 30 at times down on the dunes, so that's a good thing. And it's also good for that it's all part of the All-Ireland pollinator plan that we're encouraging biodiversity in the wilder parts and in the wildflower meadows as well.
So just finally, I thought that I'd mention a new development project, as I am relatively new here in this landscape. And there was a poem written, again, that I'm sure many of you are aware of, by Ellen O'Connell, Daniel O'Connell's eldest daughter, Derrynane, in 1832. And in the poem, there was a description of a meadow walk. And again, I'm not going to go into great detail about that, but Paddy de Bush did a lot of good work in tracing this alongside the OPW and staff here in Derrynane, who have undertaken clearing works to open up this walkway again, which I've traced on the old 6-inch map there. So it's going to be a nice addition to the garden, an extra walkway, which I think people these days are really interested in, up through the woods and terminating in a waterfall. And so, yeah, there's also been some really interesting finds along the way, some old original paving stones that were laid for this path, and a millstone also. And so this is a project that's ongoing, and it links in with the Kerry Way at the top and the old Butter Road, so it's a nice way to tie in the park to those walkways as well. So just worth mentioning. And as you can see, the reason they called it the Meadow Walk was because the old map shows fields when now it's regenerating woodland, so it's nice to walk through. And I'd just like to say, firstly, thanks very much for your attention, and I'll hand it over to James.
And the same. Thank you very much.
Don't leave, James. Stay here. I'm sure there's going to be lots of questions. Thank you both so much for that. Such an interesting talk and an amazing tour of the gardens as well, which I'm sure everyone here has spent a lot of time in. I think the links that you draw between here and several other places globally and protecting the genetics of different species in those areas is a really fascinating part of your work, so thank you for sharing that. Do we have any questions from the other rooms that are with us today in the AV room? If we just wait a moment and give them a chance. And then if there's anyone in this room, you can raise your hand and I'll come to you. Yes, so we have, you have to go down to the mic, please, if that's okay, and you can introduce yourself so we know who's speaking. Thank you.
Hello, I'm Micheline Skeffington. Thanks, James and Chris. That was fascinating, and I really want to learn more about the garden and visit it. I just have a couple of comments, and just about the pollinator, I think it's great, and perhaps just generally to say that those echiums, and we've got one at the moment, they're terrific for bees, but it is really important to have native flora and to encourage that. I just had a comment on the gunra because, as it happens, I've studied one invasive species. Not all aliens are invasive, I suppose. People think like the Kerry lily, clearly, if it's supposed to be an alien, isn't invasive, far from it. But the gunra, there are two species which we discovered when we were studying it in Galway. And gunra manicata, as far as I know, is not invasive. Maybe you know that. It's got a different kind of spike. So it's important that people are probably of necessity trying to eradicate it, to know that there are two species and that one of them is quite elegant and doesn't set seed for the most part. Unless you've got comments on that, I just thought I'd point that out. So Gunra tintoria is the one that's the real problem.
Yeah, it's tintoria is the problem for spreading by seed, but manicata, I think, it has spread a small bit by seed, but hardly at all. Tinctoria is the one that is everywhere now, and it's spreading more and more. And as Chris mentioned, it was in the 90s that it seemed a seed became more fertile because before that it only spread by the rhizome itself, so it hadn't been a problem. It's always seeds the problem. I think rhododendron, that, and even all the excitement about Japanese knotweed, at least that doesn't seed.
Yeah.
Seed can blow and eat up. It can go everywhere, anywhere and everywhere, you know. So that's more of a problem for sure.
Yeah, it's interesting. It took off in Galway in the 90s. I think there's a climate thing where there's a threshold that that never goes below, and the severe frost didn't seem to wipe it out.
No.
But yeah, thanks very much.
A question from the AV.
I just want to know the distinction between forms of gunnery for in the street between the tinctor. Is there?
Oh, the distinction. Well, you can tell often from the size of the leaves. The Manicata has a taller stem, and it has a different flower as well, slightly. So you'd have to be more a botanical expert to tell the difference between the two flower spikes. But unfortunately, I think they do hybridize as well. And I think we supposedly only had Manicata here, but we also have Tinctoria as well, or a form that hybrid between the two, you know. So the overall Tinctoria is a bit smaller.
Yeah, it's just.
Sorry? Oh.
A moment, please.
Sorry, we've lost the AV room there, so I think we're...
That's okay. Question over. Thank you.
Perfect, thank you. Is there any other questions then from here? Looks like everyone is ready for lunch, so I think
too cold and wet.
I think we'll call a close to our morning session there. And thank you. So I think there's going to be some announcements about lunch, so if everyone would just like to hold on a moment.
Thank you for that excellent session. Thanks. It was really, really great. Can I just ask everybody to go to lunch where they went for coffee? Simple message. Okay? Thank you very much indeed. And at 1:30, we resume with the Daniel O'Connell lecture delivered by Professor Maurice Brick. And again, please take your seats in the AV room, in the chapel, or in the outside marquee. Thank you.
So, good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen, and it's a great pleasure for me, David McConnell. I haven't been given the honour of being a Kerryman, but I've been associated with this wonderful place for the last 40 years and feel wonderfully at home here. In fact, first came to this part of Kerry almost in the year when the Daniel O'Connell Summer School was started. And I thought it might be appropriate just to say one or two words of thanks to two of the people who played such a role in starting it off. Of course, Maurice O'Connell as the distinguished historian, but also the person I want to mention, Tom Barrington. And I remember when we were planting our garden first, just down the way in West Cove, Tom Barrington arrived with a huge load of New Zealand flax to put into our garden, and we were friends ever since that time. So they played a terrific role in getting this summer school started. And amongst other things, of course, they published some beautiful collections of the talks, which are a really important source, I think, about Daniel O'Connell. And I should also mention a couple of ladies from that time, the great postmistress, Maura Moriarty. Some of you will remember her, the most elegant postmistress, I think, in the world, and a really delightful person who put a lot in to the starting of the summer school. And of course, the great Mary O'Connor, who's not with us today, but has done so much work for the summer school then and now. And then, of course, luckily, in I think 2013, the summer school was restarted. And of course, it's wonderful to think that Tom's daughter, Ruth, was very much involved with that. And of course, Maurice as the director of the summer school. So we're going to be privileged today to hear the lecture about Daniel O'Connell by Maurice Brick. And I keep thinking that this was written in the stars, that the lad from Cahersiveen would go on to become a very distinguished historian, and of course, in the course of his professional career, to write and think a lot about Daniel O'Connell and promote him. And of course, that's one of the most important things that this summer school does. It helps to promote this great figure of Daniel O'Connell, surely the greatest figure in modern Irish history. So this is a really important time for us to hear of Maurice. I should say that he is the Professor Emeritus of History in UCD. He's written a lot on Irish and American history. He has recently published a wonderful book, Ireland, Philadelphia, and the Reinvention of America, 1760 to 1800, which received a major prize, the Historical Research Prize of NUI. Now, in thinking about what I might say about Maurice today, I came across a quotation which some of you will know from John B. Keane. Being a Kerry-man, in my opinion, is the greatest gift that God can bestow on any man. When you belong to Kerry, you know you have a head start on the other fellow. In belonging to Kerry, you belong to the elements, to the spheres spinning in the heavens. You belong to history and romance and ancient song. It's almost unbearable being a Kerry man, and it's an awesome responsibility. So said John B. Keane. And what I want you to imagine here, of course, is that Maurice Brick has taken on that responsibility to his native county with enormous success. For example, recently he wrote, he edited a remarkable book on Kerry, History and Society, with 29 terrific chapters on his native county. He has, in particular, written a lot about Daniel O'Connell and the international influence that O'Connell had, the influence in Spain and France, the United Kingdom, of course, and the United States. But he's a many-sided person. In the 1990s, the late 1990s, he wrote the definitive paper which led the government to establish the Irish Research Council. He has been a member of the board of the European Science Foundation, one of the most important foundations for promoting science. And by the way, science in the European sense of the word, science including all knowledge, not just the sciences. I am a scientist, but science in the European context includes the arts as well, and literature, all knowledge. And that's a very, very important organization. So he is also, in a way, today coming full circle, because I heard it on the grapevine that one of his very first jobs was as a guide in Derrynane House, such a long time ago. So today we are privileged, Maurice, to have you as the keynote lecturer of this summer school to talk about Daniel O'Connell, his lives and legacy. Maurice.
Thank you very much, David, for that very generous and very flattering introduction indeed. I'd also like to start by repeating something which I said yesterday in Cahersiveen, and that is to thank the friends of the Daniel O'Connell School and our various supporters for encouraging the committee to actually present the school this year. We value very much their support and their encouragement. And this is sort of my general way of moving towards the particular, and that is to acknowledge the presence of our Bishop Ray Brown, who since his consecration in 2013 has always visited with us and has never missed a school. So again, as I look out on this rainy weather, and I'm sure Bishop Ray could be doing other things, I'd like, if I may, to acknowledge his presence and to thank him for being here. I would also like to thank the Office of Public Works, and in particular Chris O'Neill, and Adrian Corcoran for inviting the school inside these walls to present the Daniel O'Connell Lecture this year. It's a great personal privilege for me to deliver this lecture in a house which has seen, I'm sure, many eloquent and interesting debates over the years. Some of them maybe took place in this very drawing room, who knows. So it's a great pleasure and, as I said, a privilege to be here. My family and some of my friends will know, as David mentioned, that on 2 separate occasions during the 1970s, I acted as a guide here in Derrynane House in the employ of the Office of Public Works. And I remember when I got what I regarded at the time as being a nice, cushy summer job when you considered what the alternatives were. The alternatives for my peers at that time would be to work on the construction sites of London and various places like that during the summer. That did not really appeal to me at all. So I was very, very pleased to get this summer job. And I remember when I told my late mother about this, she wasn't particularly impressed. I should mention, by the way, that my mother was born very near here and had a particular idea about this house and a particular idea about the people who were here. Somebody mentioned to me earlier on about the Blue Lady. Well, the Blue Lady is part of the mythology of this part of the country, which suggests that the house was haunted. And so therefore my mother, ever protective of her eldest boy, did not want me to be exposed to any of the suspicious elements that maybe lurked around the building. So she wasn't, as I said, particularly impressed. Mind you, she didn't try and put me off, but when I told her the following day that as part of my responsibility, I was actually have to spend every second weekend living in the house, she was even more dubious about the whole enterprise. And that is how I came to spend every second weekend here in the caretaker's quarters, which at that time where the main entrance to the house is now. That is where the caretaker lived at the time. And ironically enough, the bedroom was where Daniel O'Connell's bed now lies. That is where the bedroom of the caretakers were. But in any event, so my mother, as I said, wasn't particularly impressed by this. And on my first Friday here, Michael and Bridie Maher, who were the caretakers at the time, whom I remember with great affection, they were 2 wonderful people. Off they went up to Tipperary, where Michael's mother was ill at the time, and that was why I was being given this added responsibility to be the kind of assistant caretaker in residence, so to speak. And on the first Friday night, the trees rustled and howled, and it was a dark night, and I did not feel at all comfortable. So I went into bed about 9:15 at night, which I don't do very often, left the lights on, could not fall asleep. So I did what any person would do in those circumstances. I went up to Bridie Keating's. Now, for those of you who don't know Bridie Keating was rather like Maura Moriarty, one of these great women who lived in this part of the world, who had a pub just about 10 minutes walk from here. So I decided I would go up to Bridie Keating's and maybe get some Dutch courage there from her wonderful Guinness, which I did. I spent the evening there, late into the late hours, stumbled back to Derrynane House about small hours in the morning. I won't say what time it was, just in case I get into trouble even this time afterwards. Crept into bed, left the lights on, of course, and fell sound asleep. That is until about 4 o'clock in the morning, when I was awakened by an almighty clatter on the front door. The big knocker down there, somebody was knocking. Got out of bed, bleary-eyed, drew back the curtains, looked down, to find 2 guards from Waterville down in the courtyard. So I said to them, what's the matter? What's going on? What's going on here? The guard said, we've got phone calls from all over Derrynane Beg, wondering what the lights are doing on in Derrynane House at 3 and 4 o'clock in the morning. So all I could do was, in my fortified by Guinness, as I said, and with an eloquence that Guinness can only give, I spluttered out something about ghosts and the Blue Lady and Maura Nigiv and all that sort of thing. Now, I don't know what the guards said in reply, except I remember they were particularly eloquent as well, except maybe in a different kind of way, and left me in no doubt what they thought about coming over Cummikishta at 4 o'clock in the morning, just because I happened to be afraid of the ghosts of Derrynane House and the Blue Lady. But in any event, I tell that story for a few reasons. First of all, I can't remember if I told my mother that story, but as I say, I remember her here this afternoon. And I also remember the many people that I lived and worked with here in Derrynane over the years. Because the OPW is a wonderful family, you know, once they get you into their employ and you associate with them, of course you are one of them forever. And I certainly regard myself as being a member of the wider OPW family, and it was a great pleasure to spend, as I said, these times here during the 1970s. So, as I said, I'd like to remember them this afternoon. But I also tell that story because it reminds me that when you approach the history of a house like this, and the history of the people who lived here, and in particular, its most distinguished resident, Daniel O'Connell, that story is a sort of a mixture of various sort of approaches. There's mythology, and there is folklore, and there is history, and sometimes there's a mixture of all three when you sit down to try and make sense of somebody like O'Connell. And it is in that vein, as I say, that I am approaching this lecture. That's why I didn't call it, for example, Daniel O'Connell Life and Times, or Daniel O'Connell Life and Legacies. O'Connell is far more complicated than that, and often more complicated than he is presented to be, you know. He was, to me, a man of paradox, a man of contradictions very often. And it's really in that sense I want to talk about O'Connell, as a man of paradox, a man of contradictions over the years. I mean, consider, for example, the very first contradiction, it's not quite a contradiction, it's probably the wrong word, but paradox, I think is a better word. I mean, we tend to remember O'Connell as the Catholic emancipator, the man who engineered the great campaign for Catholic emancipation in 1829. But what we do not often remember is that he also, before Catholic emancipation in 1829, he was also a very active champion of Presbyterian emancipation. David and I were talking about that during the week, when Presbyterians had particular civil liabilities, and he was one of their great champions to have those relaxed. And also, of course, why, when he entered in Parliament and took a seat in Parliament in February of 1830, why he became a champion of Jewish emancipation. So for O'Connell, emancipation wasn't tied into any particular adjective. You know, it wasn't tied to Catholicism or anything. It was tied to a belief, a more general belief, a more fundamental belief that nobody should be denied their rights and liberties on the basis of private religious belief. So there's a kind of a paradox there, even though we consider him the great Catholic. The second thing is not unassociated with it, and it is to remember that O'Connell, although he was a devout Catholic, particularly during the second half of his life, he also believed that the church and state should be separate entities. Now, again, this is a very, very big topic and be discussed in many ways, but I'll just mention three brief points here. The first is he believed that no clergyman, whatever his denomination was, should be maintained by the state. In other words, that a clergyman should not be given a salary, for example, by the state, as if he was a particular kind of public servant. This practice, by the way, was quite common in contemporary Europe and remains so in some parts of Europe, as you know, today. But it was not a principle that he espoused. For him, church and state, and the people who led church and state, the officers, if you like, of church and state, had to be separate the one from the other. And that is why, to bring me to a second point, why in 1812, when an early version of Catholic Association was published by a radical British MP, a man called Francis Burdett, why he opposed that particular version of Catholic Emancipation, because Burdett, as part of his draft of Catholic Emancipation, included a provision that Dublin Castle should be given a say in the appointment of Catholic bishops. Now, Burdett argued that this would be a way of reassuring the Protestant Church that Catholic emancipation would not entail the dismantling of Protestant culture, and that if the Catholic ascendancy, if you like, would take over from a Protestant one. O'Connell was having none of that either, because to accept that Dublin Castle should have a role in the appointment of Catholic bishops, even if it was meant to reassure the Protestants of the country, but that would suggest that Catholics, if you like, were a type of second-class citizen, a kind of suspect citizen, if you like, whose loyalty in some way or other had to be secured, and that's a contemporary word, to be secured if he was to become a full citizen. And the third aspect of this touches on a much more large topic, which is O'Connell's attitude to the tithe system. Now, the tithe system was one of the scourges, really, of pre-famine Ireland, because according to this, which was a legal provision, farmers had to pay a tenth of their produce, and of course hence the word tithe, pay a tenth of their produce towards the maintenance of the established church. And of course in Ireland the established church was the Church of Ireland. Now again, rather like the payment of clergy, there was nothing unusual about the payment of clergy to the established church, because you have it in Catholic France, where the Catholic Church got the tithe, in Spain, parts of Italy and so forth. Again, so it just depended on what the established church was. They collected the tithe. But O'Connell again had difficulty with the principle. Again, it was not tied to any particular religion. He had a difficulty with the principle, and a difficulty with the idea that in a place like Ireland, for example, that the 9/10 of the population should be obliged by law to pay a tenth of their income towards the upkeep of a church from which it received no services and no return. We often also, by the way, had a bizarre situation, where tithes, which were, as I said, intended for the enjoyment of the established Church of Ireland minister, were in some cases being collected by laymen, because, of course, as a type of property, very often the layman would simply sell his property to a layman. The layman would then give the clergyman a certain amount for the property, then the layman would go off and collect it himself, usually at an inflated rate. So you had this bizarre situation where, as I said, tithe was not only an unfair and unjust tax, but also, even as a tax which was intended for the maintenance of the established church, was, again, to use the phrase of the time, was also an immoral tax. And so therefore it should come as no surprise that protests against tithe were keenly felt in rural Ireland, because of the injustice of it, because of the immorality of it. And that gave rise, of course, to a whole litany of popular protest societies from about the 1760s on. There are various types of popular societies. There's ribbonmen, right boys, rockites, but they're all generically known as white boys. So I'm going to use the generic term white boys, even though in O'Connell's time they were very often referred to as ribbonmen. But the generic title will do here just for the sake of clarity. Now, there are, again, 2 points I want to make about O'Connell's attitudes to white boyism, because it ties in with his attitudes to violence. O'Connell was always wary of these popular protest societies. He was always wary of the white boys, not least because they were entitled to intimidate, not to negotiate with, but to intimidate by violence, if necessary, those who were involved in the tithe system. Having said that, O'Connell was in a kind of a fix, which comes back again to the difficulty of trying to tie O'Connell down. He was put in a bit of a fix by the grievance against tithe, because on the one hand, the grievance was just. On the other hand, he did not agree with their methods, and his attitude to the white boys, and by the way, he often defended the white boys when they were brought before the courts for engaging in illegal activities, as they're called. Even when these illegal activities often involved capital crime, O'Connell actually defended these white boys, even though he did not agree with their process, with their procedure. So again, there's this sort of difficulty of trying to find out O'Connell, trying to figure out where O'Connell comes. But for O'Connell, whether or not he defended the white boys in court, he would always object to their involvement with violence. Because for O'Connell, and this was to remain a feature of his life, as we know, that it was far better, if one wanted to achieve an outcome, it was far better to work within the law. And by working within the law, one did have a better chance of success. Now, this wasn't just some high-minded moral principle, although, of course, in many ways it was. But as he saw it, if people engaged in violence, that was just simply to invite the British government to apply draconian laws on them, and also to stifle out all forms of protest, regardless of their bona fides. So therefore, insofar as he was concerned, not only would it be far more effective to work together, but also it was a mug's game to be engaging in violence because it only invited the draconian arm of the law, the draconian intentions of the law, to stifle all types of protest. So as I said, as O'Connell saw it, it would be far more effective if the people would rely on what O'Connell believed was a more powerful tool. Their capacity to make their case, as I've already said, as a collective, and as a collective, by sticking together, not only to reassert the moral authority of the people, which is of course the basis of all representative government, but through it to face down the government and to hold it to account. And that is, in fact, what the Catholic Association did. That is why the campaign for Catholic emancipation was so successful. Because when O'Connell founded the Catholic Association in 1823 to drive his campaign for Catholic emancipation, the association was based on a model which actually is quite familiar to us today. In many ways, it is the basis of the modern political party, because you have a local or a parish-based system, then you had a county system, and then you had a provincial system, and you need a national system, all interacting with one another. The Catholic Association also had a Catholic rent. Now, this rent varied, of course, from a penny a month to a shilling a month, a pound a month, depending on how well off you are. But whether you're talking about it in organizational terms or in financial terms, the Catholic Association had the ability to bind everybody together in a collective. You know, it was the model, the alternative model to white boyism. And as I say, by people sticking together and working together and processing their grievance in this way, they would be defined not by militancy, but by asserting the moral authority of the people, or by asserting what today we would call people power, because that is what it was. And indeed, it was this people power which had made the Catholic Association such a distinctive and influential body, and was to make Catholic emancipation possible in 1829, even though, and people very often forget this, this marked important changes on the part of the British Constitution, you know, British monarch actually accepting that Catholics could be loyal citizens, you know. O'Connell was aware of this, and he wrote in 1829, and I quote, "The most efficient means," he says, "of counteracting the evils of a bad government is by making the people sensible of their own importance in society." By means of the Catholic Association, he says, people are now totally different. All of them have the information which is sufficient to see their true interests. We see in progress a veritable revolution in Ireland without any violation of the law, without the oppression of any individual, without rapine, without desolation, or without bloodshed, a peaceful and constitutional revolution by the people themselves, with their own means and their own capabilities. This Catholic Association has shown the value of public opinion, and how by the faith that is reposed in the integrity, honour, and genuine principles of the patriotic virtue of the people, that they could exercise a power capable of making the government of their country tremble. Having read that extract from 1829, it should come as no surprise that when O'Connell actually sat down to negotiate the actual terms of Catholic emancipation with the Duke of Wellington, who was the Prime Minister at the time, of course, Wellington insisted that the Catholic Association be disbanded. It was far too powerful an organization to be in the hands of somebody like O'Connell. And as part of that arrangement, Wellington insisted that the Catholic Association be disbanded. But of course, O'Connell agreed, and indeed was given very little option but to agree, but he did say that if needs be, he would revive it in the future. But he had established a principle which was to have a revolutionary influence in government, not just in Ireland, but in many other countries as well. And the principle was that it had shown that if the people had stuck together, they could successfully shake the Constitution to its core and achieve appropriate results. While O'Connell was making this point, that his methods had been successful and that there was nothing to be gained by whiteboyism other than the wrath of the law, he also had another reason for marginalizing popular protest. It's important to remember that these popular protesters were not just illegal organizations, not just willy-nilly organizations that had no sense of structure. because we read during the 1820s and 1830s, and indeed before that, of white boy assemblies. There are references to the white boy constitution. There are references to white boy laws. The white boy army that was led by a variety of so-called generals, colonels, and captains. O'Connell believed that with that kind of an alternative on his doorstep, that if they were not reined in under his leadership, they could challenge his standing and his power, and therefore by extension the effectiveness of his campaigns. In this regard, we should also remember, to come to another paradox, I suppose, that in any event, O'Connell, the great Gaelic chieftain as he is remembered in this part of Kerry, O'Connell the aristocrat, did not take criticism or opposition very lightly. And of course, as we know, he was famously vain. And so therefore, faced with the possibility that the white boys could evolve as a counterpower to themselves, he tried not only to integrate them within the networks of the Catholic Association, and as I said earlier, his own leadership, but also to use the organization and networks of the Catholic Church to keep them in place. The last thing O'Connell wanted, or indeed the Church wanted, was to have popular societies like the White Boys emerge as an alternative network to himself, and with it, how this might lead popular protest in Ireland into people whom O'Connell believed should be led, not people who should lead. That is what he was there for. He was the person who was born into that role. So here again, as I said, we come to this yet another paradox. O'Connell the aristocrat sitting cheek by jowl with O'Connell the champion of the people. But O'Connell also knew that it was not enough to condemn the White Boys or to coax them into following him. He had to give them a reason for sticking with them. As I mentioned earlier, the success of the campaign for Catholic emancipation was part of that case. But he also appreciated that emancipation had created an expectation that further reforms would follow across a whole range of social and political grievances. And that in order to deal with them, he also needed the support of the British government, or at least he needed the understanding of the British government to listen and perhaps even to implement reform. Because if people were to be encouraged to confine themselves to the constitutional process, that cut both ways. That cut both ways. The other side of the coin was government also had an obligation to listen to what the people had to say and, as I said, to redress that grievance. O'Connell believed that the British government understood this, but he got a very rude awakening very shortly after he took his seat in February 1830. And here I'm referring to the reform bills of 1831 and 1832. Now, these reform bills were brought in to completely reorganize Parliament in the United Kingdom. And there were three separate bills, one for England and Wales, one for Scotland, and one for Ireland. And the idea was that the number of MPs in each of these three areas of the United Kingdom, that the number of MPs should reflect the population of those areas. Now, it was fine. Britain and England and Wales got their say. Scotland had its say. But when it came to Ireland, you know, the most charitable way of putting this was that Ireland got nothing near to what it was entitled to. And it got relatively fewer additional MPs than England, Scotland, or Wales. And O'Connell was appalled when he saw this, because again, he was looking over his shoulder at the expectations of the people. And this is why he told a meeting in Dublin on the 20th of November 1832. Remember, this is 10 years before Clontarf or anything like that. He told a meeting in Dublin that Westminster was treating the Irish as inferiors, and he used that word, inferiors, and that it was impossible for a British Parliament to do effectual good for Ireland. And so therefore, when a petition to repeal the Union was proposed at the same meeting, which of course one of the first of many of these petitions, it declared that the days of asking Ireland to wait a while, quote unquote, to use again a contemporary word, to wait a while were over. And so some 10 years before the famous Clontarf meeting of 1843, O'Connell was suggesting that the Irish Reform Act had confirmed that Westminster would never do right by Ireland, that justice for Ireland, which is a phrase he very often used, which is all he wanted, that had to be fought for against a government which was not willing to reinforce him. So here again, I suppose I come back to my paradoxes. Despite that, O'Connell still believed in Parliament. He still believed in the institutions of Parliament.
imperfect though these were. Because he knew that the alternative to these institutions, Parliament, government, and so forth, Westminster, imperfect though they were, he knew that the alternative would be that the people would take things into their own hands. And he had seen the implications of this in revolutionary France. You know, it isn't again that he is against violence, but he had seen what violence could lead towards, that it could lead towards anarchy, uncertainty, and political and social revolution. There was also a second point that I might mention. O'Connell, therefore, and again this comes back to trying to figure out what the man was about, repeal, therefore, when I'm putting it in these terms, repeal, therefore, to that extent, was not anti-British. Parliament wasn't anti-British. Westminster wasn't anti-British. For O'Connell, the British parliamentary system was part of a common political legacy which Ireland shared with Britain. And if Westminster Parliament was unwilling to express that integrity, that shared, then there was a case to be made for establishing a Parliament in Ireland. If Parliament couldn't work in London, then it should perhaps work in Dublin. Again, as I said, it was part of a movement that was determined to see that justice be done for Ireland. And if Westminster was not willing to do it, then an independent Parliament in Dublin would do it by default. It was not unlike, you know, the case which some American historians make about why the American Revolution started. Many American historians will tell you that it wasn't so much that the colonists were against Britain, that therefore that's why the revolution broke out, but it was because the British government had been unwilling or indeed unable to address their grievances for several years. So therefore that the American Revolution became a revolution almost by default. In many ways, a repeal could be seen in these terms. And this brings me, I suppose, I don't know if I should tell this story or not, but what the heck. This reminds me of a story I was told about a discussion that took place during the 1980s between what I would call an Irish supporter of the SDLP and a senior advisor of the then British government. It was late in the morning, I gather. But anyway, when the SDLP person berated the British government for not giving more official support to SDLP MPs and SDLP councillors in dealing with the political representations that they got for their constituents, you know, about getting access to housing, better job, getting access to public funding and that sort of thing. The advisor replied that the British government couldn't possibly do that because the SDLP at the time, and indeed since, was a nationalist party, and regardless of how it regarded constitutional agitation, regardless of that, it was still a nationalist party, and therefore as such the obligations of the British government, to the extent that they had any, were to support only those people who supported the Union. So O'Connell's kind of position vis-a-vis the British government was not very dissimilar to that. He was sort of caught between trying to convince his followers to stick with constitutionalist politics and a British government which, as a matter of fact, did very little to help him. So as a result, given that constitutional politics in Ireland couldn't benefit from or even be encouraged by the British government and Parliament, the country should have its own Parliament. Only such an Irish Parliament based in Dublin could have the interest or knowledge, or as he put it, the requisite knowledge of facts and the cordial sincerity of intention to secure constitutionalist politics over the alternative recipes of the White Boys and their particular homemade solutions to the grievances of the day. O'Connell's belief in that Parliament and constitutional politics could solve every question, of course, did not end there. It was also reflected in how he responded to reform, particularly in an international context. Now, to talk about O'Connell's impact on international politics and the paradoxes there would keep us here until next year. But I just want to mention again a few aspects of it. The first is O'Connell's involvement in the anti-slavery movement, because here again O'Connell's commitment to the anti-slavery movement, or to the abolitionist movement as this is called, insisted that freedom and civil rights should not be defined by colour, no more than before Catholic emancipation it should be defined by creed. For him, anti-slavery was not a political or an economic matter, it was a humanitarian matter. And this led him, of course, to become a champion of the abolitionist movement, not only in Britain, but also in America, in Australia, and in India. Moreover, when slavery was abolished within the British Empire in 1833, O'Connell was one of the leaders of the parliamentary campaign against compensating slave owners for their loss, on the basis that if slave owners were compensated for the loss of their slaves, it would be to accept that slaves were a type of property, which, of course, in the eyes of O'Connell, they were not. They were human beings. Although O'Connell's views on compensation did not prevail at the time, they reflected once again a view that politics should be moved as much by what was right, or by what was moral, if you like, as much as by political partisanship. Because as O'Connell saw it, without morality, without a sense of justice, without a commitment to right over wrong, governments did not have any integrity. By extension, this also applied to the ever-growing British Empire, which at the time was spreading its tentacles throughout the world. If it wanted to be the great progressive global power it was presuming to be, then it had to have a moral attitude to the people that it ruled. O'Connell extended this interest to the United States, and although he never visited the place, he became one of the great icons of the abolitionist movement there, as we know. Perhaps the high point of this interest was the keynote address which O'Connell gave to the so-called World's Anti-Slavery Convention, which met in London during the second week of June 1840. This convention brought together over 500 delegates from all parts of the United States, Britain, Ireland, and the West Indies, who'd been mandated to represent their respective abolitionist societies in London. In 8 of these cases, the delegates were women, not men, they were women. Now, while in America there was nothing unusual about this, in the sense that women had a prominent role in the abolitionist movement, in Britain that was not the case. Their role was less prominent, if only because at the time public organizations, reform organizations, whatever their aims, did not accept that women should speak for their communities, not to mind adopt leadership positions which could lead them to vote on and to decide on what was best for society. That was a responsibility which fell to men and to men only. So therefore, as a result, when the conservative British Anti-Slavery Society, which organized the convention, refused to accept the female delegates on the basis, again, that they couldn't argue a case by virtue of their gender, O'Connell objected. And although he was the keynote speaker during that convention and a contributor to a number of its proceedings, he registered that opposition by sitting with the unrecognized female delegates and their supporters who had been assigned, or maybe better put, consigned to the upper gallery of the convention centre. It should also be remembered, and again this is very often overlooked, that O'Connell kept in touch with some of these women leaders, if only because for him in many ways their campaign complemented his own. As I say, it is a chapter of O'Connell's public life which is often overlooked, although I should add here that the movement for the advancement of women and similar reform movements were soon smothered, of course, in the United States by the swelling controversy about slavery in the United States, a controversy that just simply smothered everything else. But if there had been no movement in that direction, you'd have found a much more interesting aspect to the public history of the United States, which of course had to wait until the early 20th century for it to achieve its potential. At this point, I should mention, how are we doing for time, David? I have about 15 minutes?
Yes, you.
Okay. As a result, at this point, I might also mention that O'Connell's views did not always sit well with some of his supporters, particularly Irish American supporters in parts of America. Now, it wasn't that Irish Americans had a particular view on slavery. Some of them had differing views, particularly in the South, from those who lived in Massachusetts. But what Irish Americans did not like was the unequivocal way in which O'Connell put his views on slavery. Because for O'Connell, his views on slavery were precisely that. They were unequivocal. Slavery was, as he put it, the most tremendous invasion of the natural and inalienable rights of man. And so therefore, as a result, he, O'Connell, could not recognize any American as a fellow man except those who belonged to anti-slavery societies. As I've said, some of his supporters in America resented these views, not necessarily because they agreed or disagreed with him, but because O'Connell was telling them what to do and how to think, and suggesting also that if they disagreed with him, they were not people of integrity. For these Irish Americans, whether or not they believed in abolitionism, the so-called cause of Ireland was best interpreted in America not by Irish-based leaders, but by its American-based leaders and supporters to promote and to articulate and to present as they saw fit. In other words, as a chapter in relationships between Ireland and America, what the story of abolitionism reminds us is that even at that time, the Irish diaspora was not one big, uniform and united green blob that sat somewhere between Ireland and America, that at the very least it was the sum of many different parts, some of which did not always agree with the other. At this point, let me come back to the Catholic Church and O'Connell's reactions or interactions with the Catholic Church, and about how they involved themselves in reform. Now, I know I mentioned earlier on that O'Connell believed in the separation of church and state. But again, and this is a part of a paradox that I'm thinking a lot about and haven't quite reached it yet, but it's a very interesting topic, that he also believed that society and politics, despite the separation of church and state, he also believed that society should be informed by the principles of Christianity. Because for him, Christianity, not the so-called irreligion that he had seen in revolutionary France and its aftermath, Christianity had to set the moral compass for the renewal of 19th century Europe after years of war and turbulence and the violence of the French Revolution and its aftermath. But having said that, this was not something which could be legislated for by the people, by people like himself, are secured by the direction of the priesthood or the hierarchy. The people had to absorb those principles, that sense of morality, into their daily lives, and for themselves be encouraged to do so, not by recovering the principles of the privileges of the past, which they had lost during the time of the French Revolution, but instead to absorb what the American church were talking about at that time, and indeed what pervades Pope Francis's very first Urbi et Orbi, the same principle has here, the social mission of the church, the social gospel of the church. In other words, in the worlds of secular politics, O'Connell, of course, was talking as a liberal. He was not a conservative, he was a liberal. But within the Catholic Church, he also believed that there was the same difference and the same argument going on between liberals and conservatives. And that if you brought the two together, the best of the liberalism in secular society, the best of liberals, and again, I'm using these words in their 19th century sense, but when you use the word liberal, you think immediately of radicals, and it does not necessarily follow. But people who respected individualism in a better way, that if you could kind of see the best of liberalism in the secular world, the best of liberalism in the Catholic, and you bring the two of them together, you create something what he called Catholic liberalism. And that movement of Catholic liberalism, which drew on this commitment to reform within the church, the commitment to reform within the state, when gathered together, created a powerful, and I can't understate that, created a powerful movement in Western and Eastern Europe, which lasted pretty much down until the end of the 20th century. And as you know, in some cases, through political parties like Christian Democrats, they actually control governments and influence governments right in to the 20th century. This stress on Catholic liberalism was also the major theme of a lengthy eulogy which was given by the great French Dominican and orator Henri Lacordaire when O'Connell died in 1848. He gave this wonderful, I think it lasted for something like 3 hours, this eulogy on O'Connell. He gave in Notre Dame in 1848. And as it happens, in 2013, I was on a research trip, I stayed in the Irish College in Paris, and I actually remember reading Lacordaire's eulogy, which I would strongly encourage you to do. It's a wonderful description of how the church should be renewed after years of revolution. And the interesting thing about it is the following day it so happened that Pope Francis was selected, and he gave his first Urbi et Orbi. And having read Lacordaire the day before, there were actually a lot of resonances of what Lacordaire was talking about in Pope Francis. But then I'm no philosopher and I'm no theologian, so maybe I should leave that to people who know better than me. But it does bring me to a final anecdote which illustrates the same point. And it's an anecdote which the late Mr. Justice Adrian Hardiman, our great friend of the Supreme Court, gave here in the chapel across the way when the O'Connell School was reinstated in 2013. And Adrian Hardiman's story was about a day in 1945. I don't know if any of you remember this, when Archbishop Manzenti was consecrated as Archbishop of Budapest. Now, some of us will remember maybe Cardinal Manzenti, as he later became, as one of the iconic figures, if I can use that phrase, of the Cold War, who supported the Hungarian Revolution in the 1950s, and who ended up spending something like 20 years in political asylum in the American Embassy in Budapest until he was subsequently released to spend the final few years of his life in Rome. He was one of those people of that. Cardinal Baran in Prague was another one. But in any event, on that day in October 1945, as I say, Bishop Manzenti was consecrated as Archbishop of Budapest. And of course, at that particular point, the Soviet army were in de facto control of Hungary. There's a wonderful description. He actually refers to this in his sermon, Bishop Manzenti does. You can actually see the Soviet tanks from the vista. And it was a reminder for Archbishop Manzenti that of what could happen if a communist government would take over in Hungary. The next step was the suppression of organizations like the Catholic Church, institutions such as the Catholic Church, and what could happen if communism took over the government of Hungary. But Cardinal Manzenti, as I said, recognized these worries. It hadn't quite come to the denial of public rights yet, but he recognized these worries. But as he did so, and again, this is in his inaugural sermon, he remembered Daniel O'Connell and his campaign for Catholic emancipation in Ireland. And of course, if you remember what I suggested earlier on, this campaign for Catholic emancipation was not about the status or liberties of an individual church. It was that no person should be deprived of his or her liberties on the basis of his private religious beliefs. Because again, in 1829, O'Connell believed, again, to repeat this because it's an important point, that His Majesty's British subjects in 1829 should not be denied their rights and liberties by virtue of their private religious beliefs, be they Catholic, be they Presbyterian, or be they Jewish. But the other side of the coin was equally clear, that despite their own religious beliefs, despite their beliefs as Catholics in their own religion and in the theology of that religion, despite all that, Catholics were also willing and able to declare a loyalty to the state, even a loyalty to the state with whose ethos they didn't agree. Because, again, Manzenti talks about that. And of course, in Ireland, Catholic emancipation required Catholics to declare a loyalty to a monarch who was not only the head of state, but he was also the head of the church. But Catholics had no difficulty with that. So therefore, and of course the extended point was that Catholic peers in the House of Commons and Catholic MPs in the House of Lords similarly had no difficulty legislating for what was the better good of the community because they were Catholic. So therefore Manzenti talked a lot about this, and it is a very interesting sermon. But again, it shows, again, how this view of a man like O'Connell, this extraordinarily extended view, this benign view, this benevolent view of O'Connell, and the way it was put, not attached to Catholicism, not attached to nationalism, not attached to any of these things, but how it could have influenced people in Eastern Europe, even down to the middle of the 20th century. But then, of course, somebody would say to me, and I'll end on this, perhaps we shouldn't be surprised about that. Because this particular house here, Derrynane House, is where I know he didn't come to live here until the 1820s, but he was nurtured by this culture. And Derrynane House, remember, during the 1820s and during the 100 years before that, was not a place that was tucked away behind the McGillicuddy Reeks as if it lived in some sort of exotic world that hadn't changed for hundreds of years. It was anything but a place that remained static. It was, as we know, a centre of a thriving import-export trade. Is that the charitable way to put it? Or we'll call it, I suppose we could also call it a smuggling culture, but I won't mention that word. But in any event, the important point I want to make is that Derrynane linked this place that Derrynane was linked to France and to Spain and to Portugal and to Italy and to Austria in ways in which very few other places in Ireland were. They were internationalists. And of course, they interacted with their family, the wild geese families, you know, in all of these countries who had been exiled from Ireland during the 17th and 18th centuries and who had achieved such remarkable careers here. My colleague and good friend Declan Downey has written a lot about that. So they were part of this sort of very there was nothing staid or solid about them. It was a very dynamic and an interesting place. Now, they did not identify with the Irish Parliament up in College Green, but remember the Irish Parliament up in College Green, that's to say the Parliament that existed before 1800, was a Protestant Parliament. You know, I won't call it a Protestant Parliament for Protestant people because that's a phrase of more recent history, but nonetheless the principle is the same, that it was the Parliament that had passed the penal laws. It was a Parliament that stood for and represented the Protestant ascendancy. It was part of a political culture and community with which a place like Derrynane simply didn't identify. It identified with somewhere else. It didn't need to be looking out in Dublin. It didn't know anything about what was going on in Dublin. It knew more about what was going on in Madrid and Rome than anybody else. It was part of that culture. It was outward looking. So I suppose the final point I want to make is that as a person who was born into this world, even though he was born in Carsaveen, which also is a very cosmopolitan place, by the way, I should add, we should not be surprised that O'Connell had a map of Europe rather than a map of Ireland for his reference, and that kind of internationalist, outward-looking world never left him. With the repeal of the penal laws, of course, the focus of families like the O'Connells and the O'Mahanys, and in particular, of course, of Daniel O'Connell, began to drift back from Catholic Europe to Dublin and to London. For O'Connell, the challenge of dealing with the Catholics now sort of about to become and becoming members of the establishment themselves was not always easy to address. I remember being told on one occasion, and again, I don't know if the reference actually is correct here, but many of you will know it, and I hope I'm ascribing it properly. But somebody told me once a story about James Dillon, who subsequently became president of Cumann na nGaedheal. And somebody asked him what he thought about De Valera. And he said, yes, he said, De Valera, Mr. De Valera, he said, it's like picking up mercury with a fork. Once you have it, it slides away, you know. So O'Connell is a bit like that. And as I say, as the title of my talk suggests, there are different lives, different legacies, all of which kind of can't be discussed in the same way. Sometimes when you think you have them, it kind of slip away. But again, I suppose where I come from and where I began and where I end is with this notion, and I can't shake this notion of O'Connell as a man of paradox, a man who was a landlord, a man who was the old-fashioned Gaelic chieftain, but also the champion of the people. A Catholic, and a convinced Catholic who nonetheless could not detach religion from public, who would detach religion from public life, and a man of Ireland who, for all that, as I mentioned a number of times, was one of the leading internationalists of his time. So thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Maurice, for a splendid lecture, riveting, and I'm sure you'd be happy to answer a few questions. So maybe I could ask the people in the marquee or elsewhere, not in this room, in other words. There are no microphones. So are there microphones only here? So we are a privileged lot. We are a privileged lot, and you're very much amongst friends in here. I'm not sure anybody's going to ask you a very dangerous question. But it is up to us in this room now to put the questions to Maurice. So who would like to ask a question first of all? Indeed, Daniel. Would you please? You can come up here so other people can hear.
So, and thank you very much, Maurice. That was a very illuminating and fascinating speech you just gave. You've set out very clearly Daniel's beliefs of religious freedom of colour of your skin, of your gender, and dare I say it and use that horrible phrase, he was woke 200 years before we all caught up with him. That very strong moral guidance was countercurrent to society at the time, and it was very radical thinking. Where did he get that strong sense of moral, besides the fact he was born in Karsavik? Where do you think what was it about his upbringing or his experiences that led to that?
Thank you. I think, curiously enough, it might have to do with the fact that he was alienated from Catholicism for so long. And like a lot of famous leaders and philosophers go through that period of a religion, by which I mean being away from the church, and they read a lot. And if you look at O'Connell's deism period, where he doesn't believe in any kind of organized religion, he's reading all kinds of things, and he goes through that period. And I think it is as a result of that kind of reading, and which is not particularly focused on religion or on the merits of religion, but it gives you a kind of a view of society which enables you to question everything, and then having done that to say, yes, I think we could kind of maybe move it in this direction or that direction. I mean, I don't know. I mean, it's just that as I said, his reading of the philosophe, the Enlightenment, all that kind of thing, did not necessarily convince him to remain aloof from religion forever. But in many ways, it kind of gave him the tools to come back to religion in a funny kind of a way, I think. That's all I can speculate about that, because he does become very convinced of his Catholicism, and it isn't sort of a superstitious thing or kind of he really is convinced about the importance of Catholicism to such an extent. And as I said, this is something I'm trying to trace a bit more about the whole idea about Catholic morality, and again, it's not a confessional thing. It just is the best interest of society, that society should be permeated by the principles of Catholicism, which is why he was so interested in Catholicism, not just as a system of beliefs, but as a culture which paradoxically could promote reform if he got the church to, or the church leaders, which is why he, of course, famously fell in with some bishops and fell out with some others, I don't know if that answers your question. It's a difficult thing to try and get a sense of, but that's the best I can do.
Are there other questions? I wonder, Maurice, could I explore one question with you? Because you and I did talk about it before, and that was his relationship with the Presbyterians. So we're coming towards into the middle of the 19th century, and the repeal movement is active, the great meetings and such like. To what extent did that movement, led by O'Connell, extend to and involve the Presbyterian community in the north of Ireland, which, by the way, of course, was by far the largest community in the north of Ireland and still is the largest of the Protestant denominations there by far?
Well, there are two chapters to that answer, I think, and they're defined by chronology. The first, I suppose, relates to his involvement with those Presbyterians who were promoting reform and the end of disabilities, which are very often, remember, we forget that the penal laws were not just a set of laws that were applied against Catholics, they were also applied against Presbyterians. And Presbyterians wanted to be free of them just as much as Catholics did. And the movement wasn't quite as organized or quite as popular or quite as extensive as the Catholic Association became, but was nonetheless there. And as I said, O'Connell interacted with it publicly and supported it. He did get very involved in it because most of it was that based in the northern part of Ireland, particularly, of course, in the province of Ulster, although not exclusively there. He didn't get actively involved in it, but he wrote letters and he wrote addresses, and he made sure that the grievances of the Presbyterians were stitched into his table of grievances, if I can put it that way, which he was developing about Catholicism, and he makes a lot of references to that. And the Presbyterians acknowledged that before. And of course, a lot of the disabilities against Presbyterians were lifted before Catholic emancipation. Most of them were lifted in 1828, but it's only a year before it. But O'Connell was part of that. I won't kind of say that he was a leading part of it, but he was an important voice on that. Now, the second part of the chapter, of course, relates to the repeal period.
when the Presbyterians are part of a wider Protestant community which have reservations about repeal, because they are afraid that, again, if a repeal parliament, a separate parliament is established in Dublin, that their standing would be compromised in some way. And that applies to Presbyterians as much as to members of the Church of Ireland. So there's a different kind of a relationship. Now, O'Connell tried to open up he tried to open up the debate on union to try to recognise that, for example, by talking about federalism. It's funny enough, when Seamus Mallon was down 2 years ago, I had a long talk with Seamus about this whole notion of federalism as a solution to, well, as a solution is probably too grand a word, but as part of the debate on even contemporary Irish politics, that one would talk about federalism. And it's interesting to see, like a lot of that, it's not quite reflected in the Shared Ireland Union that the current government has in place, but it's part of that to see a kind of Ireland in this kind of wider sense of being the sum total of a lot of different units rather than just being north and south or whatever. Well, there's a bit of that in it. So I think that, so if you look back to O'Connell's talk about this, and again, I haven't done a lot of work on this, to be honest with you, but I have been reading a little bit about it, and some of it is quite interesting. What O'Connell says, that he is quite willing to have a federal kind of a solution. He uses those phrases during the 1840s. And some of the people in Ulster do row in with it for a while, but again they say, no, I don't think really that's for us ultimately. And O'Connell actually is forced to withdraw as well, because not all of his supporters agree with that either. So he's forced, to make 2 steps back, that he couldn't make the 1 step forward. He had to make the 2 steps back, so he abandoned that idea. So that's maybe a comment on your question.
Indeed. Nicholas.
Yeah, I'd like to join with the others in thanking Maurice for a very entertaining and challenging lecture. In the earlier part of the lecture, Maurice, and in the earlier O'Connell career, you're representing him as a figure of the Enlightenment, even though you didn't use that particular terminology. Now, to ask a question that is not unfair, because you have worked on this other person, Matthew Carey, an earlier generation, but nonetheless an Irish Enlightenment figure from a Catholic background. How do you think the two would compare with each other? Where and what principles do they agree, and which principles would they differ? Thank you.
Well, let me think about what I've said about Matthew Carey. I think you're more familiar with what I've said about Matthew Carey than I am at this stage, because I know you've been using it recently. Anyway, remember when you talk about Matthew Carey, I suppose, it's like everything else. At what period are you talking about? Because Matthew Carey is a reformer, he's a radical, and he remains a reformer and a radical, even though he becomes, of course, publisher of Catholic Bibles, and he becomes de facto publisher to the hierarchy in America. But he has different kind of set of attitudes, I think, to religion and the function of religion, because he's in the United States, where there is no established religion, as you know, where the whole setup, the whole religious infrastructure is so different. I'm not sure how it's very difficult to compare them, because the context in which both of them are writing and expressing themselves are so different, and because, to use that awful cliche which people invariably come out with, they're on different journeys. I just don't know how to answer that, Nicholas. Of course, Carey had a great deal of admiration for O'Connell, of course, and he lived, as you know, until the 1820s, and was president of the Friends of Ireland, as they were called, the American chapters of the Friends of Ireland, which were founded in America to support O'Connell. And he kind of hoped that O'Connell could bring about what he and other reformers in the late 18th century, because of course he belongs to that period, couldn't do. They hoped that O'Connell would succeed where they had failed. They were essentially people of the same mind. But when it comes to religion and the Enlightenment, I don't know how to answer that.
Would there be 1 or 2 more questions? It's, we have Maurice here. We can't let him go quite as easily as that. Well, I think we've had a wonderful afternoon, absolutely splendid afternoon. as I said in my introduction, it was written in the stars that the lad from Cahersveen would give yet another talk, of course, about O'Connell, because you have written so much about him and talked so much about him over the years. I think in this room, in this house, looking out on what was called this damp and wonderful climate for plants, there is an atmosphere here today, isn't there? We, I think, feel very close to O'Connell, and we feel very, 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 very much closer to him because of the way in which Morris has evoked him and made him so modern. I mean, he was such a, as Daniel said, I mean, such a modern man in so many different ways, and one wonders what influence he might have had he been able to live a great deal longer on the way our country changed over the succeeding century, really, let's say, after his birth. How would the ideas which you beautifully described today, how would they have borne on our country as we became independent and after we became independent? It's a kind of what-if-y question which can just exercise your imagination, but I look back on his influence on our country, and indeed on so many other countries, as being so positive, opening up so many different ways of thinking generously about society. So with those few words, I'd like you all, please, to join with me and thank Morris, not only for a very great lecture, of course, but also for having been one of the major organisers of the summer school since it has been reincarnated. Thank you very much, Morris.
Thank you very much for your generosity. Now, can I change my hat, so to speak, and just speak very briefly as director of the school? As I say, Mary O'Connor would normally speak at this point in the afternoon and would list a number of people that she would like to thank. And very assiduously, she sent me a list of people, which, of course, I left down in the car. So let me, on behalf of Mary, who, as I said, is at a family wedding today, let me nonetheless thank everybody and to retreat into the last refuge of scoundrels. You know who you are. And to thank everybody who's made the last 2 days possible. First of all, let me thank the people in Cahersveen yesterday, Phil O'Neill and Michael Prendergast for manning the desk on the way in Cahersveen yesterday, and here in Derrynane today. Can I also thank the other members of our committee, in addition to Mary, of course, Phil O'Neill, Christy Connell, who was our liaison with the GAA. We had a very wonderful tribute to Junior Murphy down at the field last night, which was really a very wonderful and very touching occasion. Christy O'Connell is our man there, so I'd like to thank him. And Ruth Barrington, of course, who I'm not quite sure how to describe Ruth. She's a member of our committee, but she's Minister for everything. And I'd like to thank her, particularly for her involvement here in Derrynane, with which, she has a special relationship. I'd like to thank the Office of Public Works, as I said at the beginning, for really opening this house. I know, Chris, you're not easily convinced about these matters, and that you have, and rightly so, a sense of great pride and responsibility for a house like this. But I really want to say how very touched we were, how very grateful we are that you opened this room. I know these things aren't easy, but they mean an awful lot to people like us, and they certainly mean an awful lot to the school that the Office of Public Works is willing to do that. So I'd like to thank you. I'd like to thank Adrian Corcoran as well, and the rest of the officers and people who are in Killarney. There are so many people here in Derrynane. I'm afraid I don't know most of them in Derrynane, so again, you know who you are. People who've been ushering people into the chapel, who've been involved in the teas and all that. And I must say, my profound apologies for being so neglectful in leaving this down in my car. I left my tie down in the car. I had to go down and get my tie, and I realized, oh God, I've left the list now. I'm going to have to go down again. But anyway, I didn't. So let me thank everybody for being here. I said yesterday, and I said at the beginning today that really holding the school was a big deal for us this year. we were between two minds as whether we go ahead with it. You know, it's a big undertaking organisationally. In fact, it's a much bigger undertaking this year because of the public health guidelines and the public health circumstances. It's also a financial challenge for us. But I really do want to thank everybody, as I said at the beginning, who have encouraged us to do so. We were a bit iffy about things, especially given the news of the last 3 or 4 days. But we are very grateful. We're always grateful for your encouragement, really. It means a lot to us. Not that we're looking for pats on the back or anything, but we like to be encouraged, and it's great that, as I said at the beginning, people like the Bishop and the O'Connell family, Daniel and Sue coming from London, we're very, very grateful for that. Morris from Lakeview, the first time I think we've had one of the Lakeview O'Connells here, and we look forward to meeting them here again in the coming years. And Francesca, yesterday, we'd like to welcome you here. So again, let me thank everybody. If I've not mentioned people by name, please consider yourself thanked, because things like this really can't work without everybody taking a role in it, whatever it is. So thank you very much, and safe home. And those of you who are going to Gavin Ring's concert this evening, you're in for a treat. So thank you very much.